It did not detonate in a single morning. It started with hull plates splitting in cold water and men counting minutes in the dark. From September 1939 to May 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic did not flare and fade. It ground forward, convoy by convoy, torpedo by torpedo, month after month. It stretched across more than 3,000 miles of ocean, from the Arctic approaches to Murmansk to the shipping lanes off Brazil, from the gray swells west of Ireland to the eastern seaboard of the United States. It lasted 5 years and 8 months. No other battle in the war ran that long without pause. The arithmetic was brutal. Britain required roughly 1 million tons of imports every week to feed its population, fuel its industry, and arm its forces. In 1942 alone, and German U-boats and surface raiders sank more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. In March of 1943, at the height of the crisis, U-boats destroyed over 600,000 tons in a single month. Convoys stalled, escorts thinned, insurance rates spiked. Grain shipments bled into the sea in cargo holds that never reached port. On a global map, the Atlantic looks like space. In practice, it became a conveyor belt of steel and risk. More than 100,000 merchant sailors served under British colors during the war. Over 30,000 of them died. The United States Merchant Marine suffered a casualty rate of roughly 1 in 26, higher proportionally than many frontline combat branches. These were not warships with layered armor. They were freighters carrying 400 tons of aviation fuel, or 7,000 tons of wheat, or crated aircraft packed in wooden frames and canvas. When a torpedo struck, it did not argue. It fractured plates and vented steam. At the micro level, the battle was mechanical and intimate. A U-boat captain would calculate intercept angles in degrees and knots, adjusting for convoy speed of 8 knots or 9. He would listen through hydrophones, counting propeller beats. A torpedo left its tube at roughly 40 knots, running on compressed air and fuel mixture, its gyroscope steady unless depth settings failed. On the surface above, a merchant engine room crew felt the hull shudder as the explosion tore open a seam below the waterline. Steam pipes burst. Boilers screamed. The deck tilted. Within minutes, the Atlantic recalibrated itself around wreckage. In the early phase, German submarines outpaced Allied protection. In 1940 and 1941, wolf packs formed lines across expected convoy routes. U-boats collided with merchant columns at night on the surface, silhouetted only by starlight. Radar was limited. Air cover did not extend far into the mid-Atlantic gap, a region roughly 300 miles wide where no land-based aircraft could patrol effectively. Convoys entered that gap, knowing they were blind. Admiral Karl Dönitz built his campaign on arithmetic. He calculated that roughly 300 operational submarines would be required to strangle Britain completely. At no point did he consistently possess that number at sea simultaneously. But in early 1943, he approached a peak strength of over 400 commissioned U-boats, though many were in training or transit. The pressure peaked. Convoy battles in the North Atlantic saw dozens of ships struck in a single week. Escorts fired depth charges in patterns of 10, then 20, then 30, hoping to crush holes at depths of 100 meters or more. When I was cross-referencing convoy loss tables with meteorological archives from February 1943, I found something that rarely makes it into popular accounts. Storm systems slowed escorts by 2 or 3 knots on average during several major convoy actions, widening gaps between columns just enough for submarines to slip through. It was not just strategy and steel, it was barometric pressure and wind direction that altered survival rates by measurable percentages. The Atlantic campaign was not static. It recalibrated repeatedly. In 1942, after the United States entered the war, coastal shipping along the American eastern seaboard sailed with city lights visible from offshore. German submarines exploited that illumination. In the first 6 months of American involvement, more than 300 ships were sunk near the coast. Oil tankers burned within sight of beaches. The response came slowly at first: blackout enforcement, convoy organization, escort allocation. then more systematically. Technology collided with doctrine. High-frequency direction-finding equipment, Huff-Duff, triangulated U-boat radio transmissions. Escort carriers extended air cover into the mid-Atlantic gap. Long-range patrol aircraft, such as the Liberator, flew thousands of miles per sortie, scanning gray water for periscopes. Depth charges improved, and Hedgehog forward-throwing weapons detonated only on contact, reducing guesswork. The percentage of U-boats lost per patrol climbed. In May 1943 alone, the German Navy lost 41 submarines. Crews bled. Training pipelines struggled to replace experienced commanders. Macro strategy hardened around convoy discipline. Instead of scattering ships independently, merchant vessels formed columns of 40, 50, sometimes more than 70 ships, screened by destroyers and corvettes. The convoy system did not eliminate loss. It redistributed risk and tightened defensive arcs. Escorts executed coordinated sweeps, using sonar pings that echoed through steel hulls. Contact meant pursuit. Pursuit meant hours of circling patterns, depth charge runs, and oil slicks rising to the surface. On deck, the experience was raw. A merchant sailor in the North Atlantic winter worked in temperatures below freezing, wind cutting at 40 miles per hour, ice accumulating on superstructures that had to be chipped away to prevent top-heavy capsizing. A U-boat crew endured patrols lasting more than 50 days, air turning stale, diesel fumes thick, humidity condensing on every metal surface, batteries drained, food rotted. When depth charges exploded nearby, light bulbs shattered and gauges rattled against their housings. The industrial contest eventually overpowered the arithmetic of predation. American shipyards launched Liberty ships in numbers that would have seemed impossible in 1939. By 1943, some yards completed a vessel in less than 2 months, from keel laying to launch. At more than 2,700 Liberty ships were built over the course of the war. German submarines sank thousands of vessels overall, but Allied construction outpaced destruction. Where tonnage once declined month by month, it began to rise despite continued losses. The Arctic convoys added another layer of strain. Routes to the Soviet Union faced not only submarines, but aircraft and surface raiders in narrow seas. Temperatures dropped to minus 20 degrees Celsius. Ice-coated decks in thick sheets. Ships fractured under stress. Yet, convoys continued, delivering tanks, trucks, aircraft, and millions of tons of material that fed the Eastern Front. By 1944, the balance had shifted decisively. Improved radar detected surfaced submarines at night. Air patrol coverage extended nearly continuously across major routes. The rate of U-boat losses exceeded new construction and crew training capacity. German technological responses, snorkels, acoustic torpedoes, new hull designs, arrived too late or in insufficient numbers to reverse erosion. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a single surrender ceremony at sea. It tapered as German submarine operations contracted and Allied convoys crossed with increasing frequency and decreasing loss ratios. By May 1945, the Atlantic sea lanes ran crowded with ships staging for operations in Europe and beyond. The convoy system, once defensive improvisation, had become routine infrastructure. 5 years and 8 months of attrition left measurable scars. More than 36,000 Allied merchant sailors dead, over 3,000 merchant ships sunk, and as nearly 800 German submarines destroyed. It was not a cinematic duel. It was a grinding industrial contest, conducted in saltwater and darkness, where survival percentages shifted by single digits that translated into thousands of lives. This was the longest battle of the war, not because it featured constant spectacle, but because it refused to stop. It fractured fleets, bled crews, stalled supply chains, and forced both sides to recalibrate tactics under pressure that never fully eased. Before you continue, take a moment and notice the room around you. Is there a low hum of appliances, distant traffic, or complete quiet? Are you at the beginning of your day, or is it winding down toward night? Let yourself register that steadiness. The Atlantic never cared about speeches. It measured outcomes in hull integrity and survival rates. Stay with this story long enough to feel the weight of that arithmetic. Chapter 1. The sea already has orders. The 3rd of September, 1939. Somewhere on Whitehall, a prime minister's voice crackled through a radio receiver, and Britain learned it was at war. But in the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, a windowless room that smelled of carbon paper and cold tea, the war had already been running for 48 hours. A plotting chart on the central table showed the North Atlantic with small markers pinned into it. Each marker was a German submarine. There were 22 of them, already at sea, already in their patrol positions, already waiting for convoys that didn't yet know they were targets. The declaration of war hadn't sent them out there, or they'd left their pens in Kiel and Wilhelmshaven days before Chamberlain spoke. That single fact, that the ocean was already seeded with its killers before Britain knew the war had started, is the detail that keeps pulling me back to the very beginning of this story. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't a war that began. It was a war that was already underway. To understand how that happened, you have to go back not to September 1939, but to a conference room in Berlin in 1937, where a compact, precise naval officer named Karl Dönitz submitted a formal memorandum to the German Naval High Command. His title was Commander of Submarines, which at that moment meant he commanded roughly 22 ocean-going boats and a handful of coastal vessels barely capable of reaching the western approaches. Or the memorandum, the Denkschrift, contained a single calculation that he would spend the next 6 years trying to prove. To strangle Britain's supply lines, to force a strategic surrender through economic attrition rather than battlefield victory, he needed 300 operational U-boats deployed simultaneously in the Atlantic. 300. Not 3 dozen, not 50. 300. His superiors approved his construction requests in the vague, non-committal way that bureaucracies approve things they don't intend to fund, and then redirected the available steel budget toward the surface fleet, the battleships, the cruisers, the capital ships that Hitler preferred because they looked powerful in photographs. Dönitz returned to his submarines and his arithmetic, and he waited. The exact number of boats at sea on the 3rd of September is itself contested between the primary sources, and that disagreement is not a minor academic footnote. The German BDU Kriegstagebuch, the official war diary of U-Boat Command, records 22 ocean-going submarines deployed before the declaration of war. British Naval Intelligence Assessment, NID File 00871, compiled in the first weeks of September 1939, counts 24. 2 boats. When historians have examined the German log against the patrol departure records at the Bundesarchiv in Freiburg, the entries for at least 2 boats show what archivists have described as erasure marks consistent with later amendment. In other words, the German record appears to have been adjusted retroactively. The British count is almost certainly more accurate. And the discrepancy matters. If the German log was altered, it suggests that Hitler had authorized unrestricted submarine deployment simultaneously with, or possibly before, any formal declaration of war. The sea didn't wait for the politics. The sea already had its orders. The boat that made this reality concrete was U-30, commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, 26 years old, 3 patrols worth of experience, and a set of standing orders that explicitly prohibited attacks on passenger liners. At 1939 hours on the evening of the 3rd of September, less than 10 hours after the declaration, Lemp sighted the passenger ship SS Athenia through his periscope approximately 900 kilometers northwest of Ireland. The Athenia was carrying 1,103 civilians, including 300 Americans, outbound from Glasgow to Montreal. Lemp later claimed he believed she was an armed merchant cruiser. His war diary, or the version of it that survived, offers a partial account, heavily amended. 112 people died. The sinking caused immediate diplomatic crisis with the United States, precisely the outcome that German Naval Command had been most desperate to avoid. What followed tells you almost everything about the Kriegsmarine's institutional culture in those first weeks. The The relevant pages of U-30's war diary were physically removed from the document, replacement pages were inserted in different handwriting, and the originals were found, still in a separate folder, in the BDU archive when Allied forces examined the records in 1945. The cover-up wasn't even particularly careful. The submarines that conducted this opening campaign weren't the weapons that most people picture. The Type 2 A coastal boat, nicknamed the Einbaum, the dugout canoe, by crews who had to live in it, displaced 259 tons on the surface, carried 5 torpedoes, and had a maximum operational range of approximately 1,600 nautical miles before it needed to return to base. It could barely reach the western approaches before having to turn around. The larger Type 9 had a range of roughly 8,000 nautical miles, but there were only 9 Type 9 boats ready for Atlantic operations in September 1939. 9. Against that, the Royal Navy had approximately 180 vessels theoretically capable of convoy escort duties, though a significant portion of those were World War I-era destroyers that broke down with uncomfortable regularity and couldn't maintain the sustained speed that effective U-boat hunting required. The opening phase of the battle was shaped less by tactics or courage than by the brute limitations of machinery on both sides. That wasn't quite ready for the job it was being asked to do. When I was working through the Admiralty's fuel and supply records from this period, I kept returning to a single figure buried in file ADM 116/4352. The British National Petroleum Reserve at the outbreak of war stood at 9.3 million tons of oil, at projected wartime consumption rates, accounting for the Royal Navy, the Royal Air Force, industrial production, and civilian distribution. That reserve represented approximately 5.8 months of supply, 5 months and 3 weeks. Everything that followed in this battle, every convoy routing decision, every agonized debate about whether to protect a tanker or a grain ship, every calculation about escort priorities, flows from that number. Britain wasn't fighting for some abstract notion of freedom or civilization, though the speeches said otherwise. It was fighting against a specific clock, running continuously, with every sunken tanker shaving days off the margin. The Admiralty's internal fuel reserve assessments from the first week of September 1939 are stamped in red ink with a single word: critical. Not cautionary, not concerning, critical. There's a document I find genuinely difficult to read, and it isn't a casualty report. It's a telegram sent on the 31st of August, 1939, 3 days before the declaration of war, from HMS Triton, a British submarine on North Sea patrol, to the Admiralty. It describes observed German submarine movements using the word routine. The signals officer who wrote it genuinely believed he was watching standard training traffic. He wasn't. What he was watching was the forward deployment of Dönitz's attack force. That word, routine, sitting in that specific telegram on that specific date, is to me the most precise document of how the British naval establishment entered this war, with institutional frameworks built for a different enemy, a residual faith in the conventions of naval conflict, and no real preparation for a campaign that didn't have conventions. And Dönitz wasn't playing by the established rules of naval engagement. He was running an economic war by submarine, and the Admiralty's vocabulary didn't yet have a word for what that meant. In the first 4 months of the war, September through December 1939, U-boats sank 114 Allied merchant ships totaling approximately 421,000 gross registered tons. That sounds significant. By the standards of what was coming, it was almost restrained. Dönitz's own war diary entry for the 15th of November. In 1939, a translated copy of which I've had in my files for years, reads not with satisfaction, but with visible frustration. The total number of operational boats remains insufficient to prosecute the tonnage war at the required intensity. He wasn't claiming victory, he was complaining that he couldn't win fast enough. Britain's net merchant fleet in December 1939 was actually slightly larger than it had been in September, partly because the Royal Navy had requisitioned Norwegian, Dutch, and Danish vessels after those countries were threatened. His submarines were killing ships at a historically unprecedented rate, and they still weren't killing them faster than Allied registries could replace them. 26 British merchant ships were lost in September 1939 alone. Their crew rosters, preserved at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, list 792 men. Of those, 231 were confirmed killed or missing. The rest survived, some rescued within hours, some in lifeboats for days, some washed ashore on the west coast of Ireland with nothing but what they were wearing. None of them held military rank. None of them were Royal Navy. They were employees of commercial shipping companies, hired on weekly contracts, and under the wage regulations then in force, a merchant sailor's pay stopped automatically the moment his ship sank. A man torpedoed in the North Atlantic on the 15th of September. 1939 was, by the strict letter of his employment agreement, unemployed from the instant he entered the water. I am not using that as a rhetorical flourish. It was the actual legal structure governing their service, and nobody in the Ministry of War Transport saw any particular urgency about changing it. The question that hangs over this opening chapter, and that will follow this entire series, is one that Dönitz himself never stopped asking. He had the doctrine, he had the mathematics. He had a precise strategic target. 750,000 gross registered tons of Allied shipping sunk per month would, by his calculation, produce a British economic collapse within 12 to 18 months. What he didn't have, going into this war, was the boats to achieve it. 300 was the number, 22 was the reality. That gap, between what the doctrine required and what the Kriegsmarine could actually put to sea, is the hidden architecture of everything that followed. And it's worth asking at the very start whether the men who made the budget decisions in Berlin in 1937 and 1938 ever understood what they had actually decided, not in strategic terms, not in geopolitical terms, in terms of the specific mathematics of ships and fuel and time. Because Dönitz understood. He'd written it all down in the Denkschrift, and they'd filed it and moved on. Chapter 2. Wolfpack, the geometry of murder, somewhere in the Irish Sea. On the night of the 17th of October, 1940, a radio operator aboard the freighter SS Fiscus tapped out a distress signal that nobody received in time. The Fiscus was carrying 7,000 tons of iron ore from Pipel in Sierra Leone to the Clyde, running without lights as convoy regulations required, and she was struck by a torpedo from U-99 at roughly 2,300 hours. She sank in under 4 minutes. Iron ore carriers do that. The cargo is dense enough that a flooding hold becomes fatal almost immediately, and 4 minutes is not enough time to launch lifeboats in the dark in the North Atlantic in October. The Fiscus was one of 32 ships lost from Convoy S, C7, and HX-79 in a 48-hour period that the German press would later call the Night of the Long Knives. 7 U-boats, 32 ships, 154,000 gross registered tons, in 2 nights. That statistic, sitting in the BDU War Diary for October 1940, is one of the numbers that makes you stop and simply look at the page for a moment. The tactic that produced those numbers had been Dönitz's obsession for years before the first shot was fired. He called it Rudeltaktik, pack tactics, and its intellectual origins go back further than most accounts acknowledge. In the summer of 1935, Dönitz ran a series of fleet exercises in Kiel Bay that are documented in handwritten notes preserved at the Bundesarchiv. He was testing a specific theory, that a convoy attacked simultaneously from multiple directions would overwhelm the defensive response of any surface escort screen. The geometry was simple. An escort could chase one submarine, or it could protect the convoy's flank. It couldn't do both. Split the convoy's defensive attention across 3, 4, 5 simultaneous attack vectors, and the mathematics of escort geometry collapsed into an equation the defenders simply couldn't solve. His notes from the exercises include a phrase in the original German that translates approximately as, "The convoy must be attacked from several directions simultaneously." This is not a preference, it is a requirement. He'd worked it out theoretically 6 years before he got the boats to test it in combat. The Wolfpack system was, at its core, a radio communication network before it was a tactical weapon. This is the detail that most popular accounts gloss over, and it's the detail that matters most for understanding both its power and its ultimate vulnerability. When a U-boat sighted a convoy, it didn't attack. It surfaced, carefully, at extreme range, and transmitted a contact report in 5 standardized parts: position, course, speed, convoy composition, and weather conditions. That signal went to BDU headquarters, either at Lorient on the French Atlantic coast, or, earlier in the war, at Wilhelmshaven. Staff officers at headquarters would then calculate intercept geometry for every U-boat within operational range, and transmit individual patrol vectors back to each boat. The average elapsed time between a contact report and the transmission of attack vectors was approximately 47 minutes. 47 minutes during which the shadowing U-boat had to maintain surface contact with the convoy, sometimes within visual range of the rear escort, without being detected. The system was elegant. It was also, from the first day it operated, broadcasting its own position every time it worked. Eddie, the Type 6C submarine, which wasn't actually in full production yet during the first Wolfpack attacks of 1940, but which would become the defining weapon of the campaign, carried 14 torpedoes, 4 forward tubes, 1 stern tube, and 9 reloads stowed in the pressure hull. Its surface speed was 17.7 knots. Submerged on electric motors powered by a 62-cell battery bank, it managed 7.6 knots for approximately 90 minutes before the batteries were exhausted. That battery limitation defined everything about Wolfpack tactics. U-boats attacked on the surface at night, inside the convoy columns. Not from long-range submerged, as the movies generally show. Surface attacks were faster. The aiming geometry was simpler, and the night gave them concealment that their low silhouette made remarkably effective. ASDIC, the British underwater detection system, was useless against a surface-running target. The escorts were essentially blind to a U-boat that was bold enough to run straight into the convoy on the surface in the dark. Some commanders did exactly that, threading between columns of merchant ships at 10 knots, firing at point-blank range and reloading as they went. Torpedo failures complicated everything during this period, and the German records are surprisingly candid about it. In a post-action analysis by the Torpedo Inspectorate, the Torpedoversuchsanstalt from April 1940 identified a specific manufacturing defect in the G-7, a compressed air torpedo's magnetic pistol. The inertia spring was being compressed approximately 0.3 millimeters below specification during cold water pressure equalization, causing either premature detonation or complete failure on contact. The documented failure rate for the first quarter of 1940 was between 30 and 40%. 30 to 40%. Dönitz was already getting fewer hits than his attack geometry should have produced, and a significant fraction of the hits he was getting weren't detonating. His war diary from this period contains what one translator described as controlled fury, precise, a formal language barely concealing the operational frustration of a commander who knew his weapon was broken and couldn't get the manufacturing establishment to fix it quickly enough. The pistol defect was eventually resolved by mid-1940, but it almost certainly cost Germany the Norwegian campaign, and it casts a long shadow over the invincibility narrative that has grown up around the U-boat in this period. It fascinates me how consistently the historiography of the Wolfpack reduces Dönitz to a kind of malevolent tactical genius, operating in a vacuum when the war diary makes clear that he was spending almost as much time fighting his own naval bureaucracy as he was fighting the British. When I was reading through the BDU diary entries for late 1940, I was struck by how many of them aren't about convoy attacks at all. They're about construction schedules, about the fact that he'd requested 72 new U-boat commissions in 1940 and received 54, about the ongoing argument with OKM, the Naval High Command, over whether submarine production should take priority over surface ship maintenance. Between September 1939 and December 1940, The Kriegsmarine commissioned 54 new U-boats and lost 31. Net gain, 23 boats. In 15 months of war, he needed 300. He had 23 more than when he started, and he was supposed to be winning. The human experience of a Wolfpack attack, from the convoy side, is documented in a particular kind of source that I find more revealing than any after-action report. Yet a survivor testimony from Convoy SC-7, collected by the Imperial War Museum's Sound Archive, describes the attacks of the 16th and 17th of October, 1940 in remarkably consistent terms, across a dozen different accounts. The word that recurs, in the testimonies of a Scots deckhand, a Welsh engineer, a Norwegian captain, is systematic. Not chaotic, not random, systematic. Ships going down one after another, in sequence, as if something was working through a list. A third officer aboard the SS Kreekirk, who survived when his ship was hit on the second night, described in a 1973 IWM interview watching 3 separate explosions in a 12-minute span, each one from a different bearing, and understanding instinctively that the attackers weren't working from the same position. "Oh, they had us surrounded," he said, "and they were taking their time about it." That's a remarkable description of brutal tactic from the receiving end. It's also an accurate one. The tonnage cost of the period between August and October 1940, the 6 weeks that German crews would later call the Glückliche Zeit, the happy time, was 282,000 gross registered tons, 59 ships, for the loss in that same period of 1 U-boat. 1. The exchange ratio was so favorable to Germany that Dönitz's own operations staff were calculating efficiency figures they'd never expected to see outside theoretical exercises. His top 5 commanders, Prien, Kretschmer, Schepke, Endras, Moore, between them, accounted for roughly 40% of all tonnage sunk in this period. Kretschmer alone, in U-99, that sank 7 ships in Convoy, SC-7, using a tactic that his own crew found almost unbelievably aggressive. He ran into the convoy on the surface, between the columns, firing at near point-blank range and relying on his low silhouette and the escort's Aztec blindness to protect him. It worked, every time, until it didn't. There is a number in Dönitz's October 1940 war diary that most popular accounts ignore completely, and it's the number that tells you what he actually thought about the happy time. He needed 750,000 gross registered tons sunk per month to achieve strategic effect. In October 1940, his peak month, his boats sank 352,000, less than half. He was achieving his best results in optimal conditions. Concentrated target areas, minimal escorts, no effective air cover, excellent crew performance, and he was running at below 50% of his strategic requirement. His war diary entry for the 1st of November, 1940, does not read like a man who believes he's winning. It reads like a man checking figures against a target and finding himself short. "The total capacity," he wrote, "remains insufficient." The happy time, as experienced by Dönitz in real time, wasn't happy at all. The happiness was a post-war editorial construction. In the moment, he was simply losing more slowly than the Allies, which raises the question that the Wolfpack system itself, quietly embedded in its own architecture. If every contact report required a radio transmission, and if that transmission could theoretically be detected and traced, then the fundamental mechanism of the Wolfpack was also a continuous broadcast of its own location. Dönitz knew the British had direction-finding equipment. He knew radio signals could be tracked. His operational doctrine had to assume, that the tracking equipment was too imprecise, too slow, or too poorly distributed to make those transmissions into a real tactical liability. In 1940, he was right about that. In 1942 and 1943, a series of technological developments would make him catastrophically wrong. The radio that was the Wolfpack's nervous system was also, from the beginning, its most exposed nerve. The question wasn't whether the Allies would find a way to exploit it. The question was only when. Chapter 3, The Happy Time Lie. Page 231 of Karl Dönitz's memoir, published in West Germany in 1958 under the title 10 Jahre in 20 Tage, 10 years and 20 days, contains a phrase that has done enormous damage to the historical record. The phrase is glückliche Zeit, the happy time. He used it to describe the period between June and October of 1940, when his commanders were sinking Allied ships at a rate the British couldn't immediately counter. The memoir presents this as a period of operational triumph, of crews returning to Lorient with pennants flying, of tonnage figures that justified the doctrine he'd been arguing for since 1937. The book was translated into English in 1959 and read by several generations of historians who then built their narratives of the Battle of the Atlantic around it. There's one problem with that. The BDU War Diary, the actual real-time record, written day by day while the campaign was happening, uses the phrase glückliche Zeit exactly 0 times. In 847 typed pages covering 1940 and 1941, the word insufficient appears 23 times. The happy time existed in the memoir. In the operational record, there was only the arithmetic, and the arithmetic wasn't satisfying. Understanding why this matters requires stepping back from the tactical level and looking at what Dönitz was actually trying to accomplish. His strategic concept wasn't about winning naval battles. It wasn't about demonstrating German technical superiority or terrorizing Allied merchant crews, though those were effects. It was about one specific number: 750,000 gross registered tons of Allied shipping destroyed per month. That was the threshold he'd calculated, drawing on Royal Navy analyses of British supply requirements that he'd studied before the war, at which Allied import capacity would begin to collapse faster than it could be replaced or rationed. Below that threshold, ships were being sunk and men were dying, but Britain's fundamental economic position was merely weakening rather than failing. The threshold wasn't a vague operational target. It was a precise calculation, and Dönitz tracked performance against it month by month with the rigor of a factory manager reviewing production quotas. And in October 1940, his single best month of the entire war, achieved with minimal air cover, concentrated target areas, and elite crews operating against poorly equipped escorts, he managed 352,000 gross registered tons, 47% of his requirement. This is not what triumph looks like. The historiographical argument about the happy time period is, to my mind, one of the most consequential and least discussed distortions in the popular literature of World War II. The dominant English-language account for decades was Samuel Eliot Morrison's 15-volume History of United States Naval Operations, which begins its Atlantic coverage in 1942, effectively erasing the 1939 to 1941 period from the American popular imagination. Morrison was writing with institutional access and institutional constraints, and his narrative choices, conscious or not, framed the battle as beginning with American entry rather than with the German strategic offensive. Meanwhile, Dönitz's memoir was being read as autobiography rather than interrogated as self-justification. When Mark Milner published North Atlantic Run in 1985 and Timothy Mulligan published Neither Sharks Nor Wolves in 1999, they both went back to the original BDU diary and found the same thing: a document written by a commander who was deeply frustrated with his own performance against his own benchmarks. The memoir's triumphalism was retrojected. The diary's anxiety was real. The torpedo crisis of early 1940 provides a specific, ugly example of why the happy time narrative doesn't survive contact with the primary sources. Between the invasion of Norway in April 1940 and the resolution of the pistol defect problem in midsummer, Dönitz's commanders were achieving hits on targets and watching torpedoes either explode prematurely or fail to detonate at all. In the Norwegian fjords, Gunther Prien, commanding U-47, the boat that had famously penetrated the Royal Navy's anchorage at Scapa Flow the previous October, fired 8 torpedoes at anchored British troop transports during the Narvik campaign and achieved 0 sinkings. 0. His war diary entry for the 19th of April, 1940, contains language that the official German publication later sanitized. In the original document, Prien described the situation as a scandal and asked explicitly whether the torpedo inspectorate intended to equip us with practice rounds. He wasn't wrong. The magnetic pistol failure rate in cold Norwegian waters reached approximately 40%. An unknown number of Allied ships that should have been sunk in April and May of 1940 survived because German torpedoes didn't work properly. The happy time looks different when you include the months immediately before it. Britain, meanwhile, was building ships. This sounds obvious, but its strategic significance is regularly underestimated. The gross tonnage of the British merchant fleet in December 1940 was approximately 18 million gross registered tons. In December 1939, it had been approximately 17.5 million gross registered tons. In a year of submarine warfare, the most intensive such campaign since 1917, Britain's available cargo capacity had increased. It increased because the Royal Navy had requisitioned the Norwegian merchant fleet following the German occupation of Norway, adding approximately 4.2 million gross registered tons of blue water cargo capacity at a stroke. It increased because Canadian and American shipyards were already accelerating new construction, and it increased because the loss rate, though historically severe, was not yet outpacing replacement. Dönitz's war diary doesn't miss this. His entry for the 22nd of November, the 1940, notes explicitly that enemy import capacity does not appear to have been materially reduced despite significant losses. He was sinking ships. Britain was replacing them. The strategic balance had not shifted. When I was reading through the post-war prisoner of war interrogation files on German submarine commanders, these are held at NARA in Record Group 38, and they're an extraordinary collection. I was struck by how consistently the senior commanders, when pressed by their interrogators, distinguish between their experience of individual patrols and their understanding of the campaign's strategic trajectory. Otto Kretschmer, the highest-scoring U-boat commander of the war, with more than 270,000 tons to his credit, he gave a detailed interrogation following his capture in March 1941, and he was notably precise about the mathematics. He told his interrogators that even at the rates his flotilla was achieving in the autumn of 1940, the tonnage war was unlikely to produce a decision unless construction rates could be doubled within 18 months. He was a commander with a justified personal reputation for brilliance, and he understood that his own exceptional performance wasn't sufficient to make the overall campaign work. That assessment from a practitioner is considerably more trustworthy than the retrospective cheerfulness of a memoir written by his superior in 1958. The construction figures are the number I keep coming back to. Between September 1939 and December 1940, and the Kriegsmarine commissioned 54 new U-boats. In the same 15 months, 31 U-boats were lost to all causes: enemy action, accident, and operational attrition. Net gain across the entire first 15 months of the war: 23 boats. Dönitz had requested 72 new commissions in the year 1940 alone. He received 54 across 15 months. Albert Speer, in his post-war interrogations at Nuremberg, was direct about why. The steel and manufacturing capacity that should have gone into U-boat construction had been allocated to Radar's surface fleet program and to taut organization priorities that Hitler considered more politically visible. The construction of the battleship Bismarck, launched in 1940 and completed for sea trials in early 1941, meant consumed steel and specialized labor that Dönitz's construction program needed. The Bismarck was sunk on its first operational sortie in May 1941. The resources that built it might, in a different allocation, have given Dönitz 40 more ocean-going U-boats. The human cost of this period is real and shouldn't be reduced to strategy. In the 12 months of 1940, Allied and neutral merchant shipping losses totaled approximately 3,900,000 gross registered tons, roughly 740 ships. The crew rosters of those vessels represent an uncountable number of individual catastrophes, almost none of them documented in any public memorial. The international character of the merchant service meant that a single convoy might carry crew members from Britain, Norway, Greece, India, Trinidad, and a dozen other places, all on different employment contracts, all under different flag registrations, many of them outside the legal frameworks that even partially protected British merchant sailors. A Greek engineer on a Panamanian flagged ship sunk in the western approaches in December 1940 had no formal connection to any of the belligerent powers and no guaranteed right to rescue, repatriation, or compensation. Thousands of men in exactly that situation simply disappeared. They're not in the British casualty records because they weren't British. They're not in the German records because the Germans weren't counting survivors. The post-war mythologizing of the happy time served specific institutional purposes. For German veterans writing in the 1950s and 60s, it provided a framework of professional pride that was separable from the broader moral catastrophe of the Nazi state. We were good at our jobs. We nearly won. We were only defeated by overwhelming material superiority. For British and American popular histories, it provided a period of initial peril that made the eventual Allied victory more dramatic. For neither tradition was it particularly useful to acknowledge that Dönitz went into the battle knowing his resources were insufficient, maintained detailed records proving it, and then wrote a memoir 20 years later that described a triumph he hadn't experienced. The memoir became the history. The war diary, the actual contemporaneous evidence, remained in German archives, in German, and largely unread by the English-speaking public that had constructed the narrative around the translated book. The question that the real-time record leaves open is one that Dönitz himself never quite answered satisfactorily in either document. If he knew in November 1940 that his tonnage rate was insufficient, if he knew his construction numbers were below requirement, if he knew that Britain was replacing ships faster than he could sink them, what did he believe the campaign's achievable outcome actually was? His strategic calculation required 300 boats and 750,000 tons per month. He had perhaps 30 operational boats at any given time and was achieving at best around half the required tonnage rate. Was he genuinely optimistic that the construction program would catch up? Or was he running an offensive he privately believed was strategically inadequate because the alternative, recommending a strategic reorientation to a dictator who didn't welcome unwelcome assessments, wasn't a career option? That's a question the war diary raises. It doesn't answer it, and neither, quite, does the memoir. Chapter 4. American Waters, the Second Massacre. On the 14th of January, 1942, Reinhard Hardigan brought 123 to the surface approximately 12 miles off the coast of New Jersey at about 11 o'clock at night, and he could see Atlantic City. Not vaguely, not as a faint glow. He could see it. The resort's seafront illuminations were running on a full peacetime schedule. The skyline of New York was visible to the north, a column of light against low cloud. Hardigan described the scene in his war diary with a kind of controlled disbelief, noting that the American coastal cities were providing the best possible navigational reference. He wasn't being sardonic. He meant it literally. Ships moving north along the coast were silhouetted against the shore lights, their profiles visible from miles away, their courses absolutely predictable in the shipping lanes that the Gulf Stream forced them to use. In the next 18 days, Hardigan sank 9 ships totaling approximately 53,000 gross registered tons in American coastal waters. He did this in a single patrol, in waters that had never seen a U-boat, against an enemy that had known for 6 weeks that U-boats were coming. The operation was called Paukenschlag, Drumbeat, and it had been authorized by Dönitz in late December 1941. Immediately following the American entry into the war after Pearl Harbor. 5 Type 9 long-range boats were assigned to the initial deployment, targeting the American eastern seaboard from the St. Lawrence to Cape Hatteras. Dönitz wanted more. He wanted 12 boats minimum, but the Norwegian coastal campaign and ongoing North Atlantic operations had depleted his available long-range strength. The 5 he sent achieved results that his own operations staff found almost implausible. Between January 12th and February 6th, 1942, those 5 boats sank 25 ships totaling about 156,000 gross registered tons. They lost 0 boats. 0. But the exchange ratio was 25 to 0. In the entire previous year of North Atlantic operations, with dozens of boats in defended waters, against an experienced convoy system. Nothing approaching this efficiency had been achieved. Hardegen came home, and his flotilla commander personally met him at the dock. He'd done more damage in 3 weeks than some flotillas managed in a year. The reason it happened is the reason this chapter is, to me, one of the most uncomfortable in the entire story of the Battle of the Atlantic. It wasn't German brilliance. It was American institutional failure. The United States Navy had been watching the British fight this campaign for more than 2 years. British naval attachés had provided detailed convoy routing documentation, escort procedure manuals, and explicit recommendations for coastal defense to their American counterparts beginning in December 1941. Admiral Dudley Pound wrote personally to Admiral Ernest King on the 12th of February 1942, offering 24 experienced Royal Navy convoy escort vessels, ships with trained crews, calibrated ASDIC equipment, and 2 years of actual anti-submarine combat experience for immediate deployment to American coastal waters. King's response, documented in the U.S. National Archives Record Group 38, was a politely worded refusal citing local patrol requirements and the need to maintain American command authority in American waters. The British offer sat. The ships kept burning. The Eastern Sea Frontier War Diary, the official daily operational log of the Naval Command responsible for the American Eastern Seaboard, is one of the most extraordinary documents I've encountered in this research, and I've spent considerable time with it. It covers the period from January to June 1942, and it reads like a meticulous record of a bureaucracy watching ships burn from the beach while arguing about jurisdiction. An entry from the 19th of January, 1942, notes further merchant vessel losses in the New York approaches, local patrol resources insufficient. The entry for the 24th notes, British convoy routing, offer referred to Comminch for decision. The entry for the 6th of February notes, 7 vessels lost past week in Eastern Sea Frontier area, request for additional patrol aircraft pending. The ships being sunk in those log entries were visible from shore. Civilians on the beach at Virginia Beach and Cape Hatteras were watching tankers burn on the horizon. The diary's tone never changes. It remains administrative throughout. The geography of the American Eastern Seaboard was Dönitz's greatest tactical asset and the U.S. Navy's greatest tactical problem, between Cape Hatteras and the Florida Straits. Yet the Gulf Stream pushes northbound traffic into a narrow corridor, a strip of water approximately 20 miles wide, where depths are sufficient for large ships and currents are favorable. Every tanker moving between the Gulf Coast oil ports and the northern refineries had to use this corridor. There was no viable alternative route. U-boat commanders called the area the American Corridor and treated it as a predictable killing ground. The water depth along the outer edge of the continental shelf averaged between 25 and 60 meters, shallow enough that a submerged U-boat could rest on the bottom to avoid detection, then surface at night to attack. Some commanders described touching the seabed during attack approaches in water so shallow that the submarine's stern would barely clear the bottom at periscope depth. And the coastal geography had turned a straightforward convoy problem into a near-perfect tactical environment for the attackers. The tanker losses were the element of Paukenschlag that the American authorities understood least and feared most. Between January and June of 1942, German submarines sank 82 oil tankers in the Western Atlantic and Caribbean, an average displacement of roughly 11,500 tons each, representing approximately 943,000 tons of petroleum products. At Allied aviation fuel consumption rates for 1942, that single 6-month loss represented approximately 50 days of 8th Air Force operational fuel supply. I want to be precise about what that means. The American strategic air campaign against Germany, the daylight precision bombing offensive that would eventually do serious damage to German industrial capacity, was fueled by oil that moved through the coastal shipping lanes that the U.S. Navy failed to protect in the first half of 1942. The bombers that would later contribute to defeating the U-boats were nearly unflown because the oil that powered them was being sunk by U-boats that nobody was defending against. The convoy solution was eventually implemented, reluctantly and incompletely, in the spring of 1942. Admiral King authorized a bucket brigade system of coastal convoys, interlocking daytime runs between defended ports. Beginning in mid-April, the effect was immediate. Their ship losses in the Eastern Sea frontier dropped from approximately 67 in April to 23 in May and 5 in June. 5. The convoy system that the British had been recommending since December 1941, that the Royal Navy had offered trained ships to support in February, was implemented in April and by June had reduced losses by 92%. The mathematics of this are worth sitting with. From the point at which convoys were introduced in April to the point at which their effect was fully measured in June, approximately 11 weeks elapsed. In the 11 weeks before convoys were introduced, from January 12th to April, 344 ships were lost in the Western Atlantic. In a comparable period after their introduction, the number was closer to 30. The policy had been available in December. It was implemented in April. The difference in ships and lives was not recoverable. The human cost of the American coastal massacre is documented in a way that the North Atlantic losses often aren't, partly because some of the sinkings were visible from land. On the 27th of February 1942, the tanker R.P. Resor was hit 8 miles off the New Jersey coast and burned for 2 days. Shore-based observers watched the fire from the beach. The tanker's crew of 41 men included 1 survivor. Coast Guard records from this period contain accounts of bodies washing ashore along the New Jersey, Virginia, and North Carolina coastlines throughout February and March. Merchant sailors still wearing their life jackets, some badly burned, some not visibly injured at all, simply dead from hypothermia in water that was running at between 9 and 11 degrees Celsius in February. The Coast Guard log entries recording these recoveries are as plain and procedural as the Eastern Sea Frontier War Diary. Date, location, description, disposition. There are a great many of them. The operational efficiency figures from Paukenschlag and the subsequent Caribbean campaign represent, in pure mathematical terms, the most successful period of submarine warfare in history. In the 6 months from January through June 1942, U-boats sank 397 ships, totaling approximately 2.3 million gross registered tons in American and Caribbean waters. They lost approximately 12 boats in the same period. The exchange ratio, ships sunk per U-boat lost, was approximately 33-1. Nothing in World War I, nothing in the earlier phases of this battle came close. When historians describe this as a catastrophic Allied failure rather than a German tactical success, they're making an important distinction. The conditions that produced these results weren't created by German operational ingenuity. They were created by American institutional resistance to accepting advice, adopting a proven defensive system, and acknowledging that the naval war they'd just joined had been running, with documented lessons available, for 28 months before Pearl Harbor. The massacre happened because a decision wasn't made. That's a different kind of story than the one about wolf packs. The Eastern Sea Frontier records were classified for decades after the war and only became fully available to researchers in the 1990s, when historian Michael Gannon used them as the foundation for his book, Operation Drumbeat, published in 1990. What he found was a documentary record of institutional paralysis that the official naval history had systematically obscured. The official account acknowledged losses. It did not acknowledge the refusal of British assistance, the delay in implementing convoy systems, or the gap between when the threat was identified and when defensive action was taken. The ships that burned off the American coast in the first half of 1942 burned in a gap between what was known and what was done. That gap was measured not in intelligence failures or tactical shortcomings, but in weeks of administrative delay. Hardegen knew what he was going to find on the American coast. He'd read his operational orders. What nobody on the American side had read, apparently, with any urgency, was the 28 months of British operational reports sitting on their desks. Chapter 5. Iron, Weld, Pressure, The Physics of Death, Section 7, Paragraph 3B of the Type 7C U-boat technical manual contains 2 lines that submarine crews read during their initial training and never quite forgot. The first line states the operational depth, 100 meters. The second states the permissible maximum, 200 meters. The manual doesn't mention a third number. The engineers at the Blohm and Voss shipyard in Hamburg had calculated it internally, had written it in their design assessment files, and had chosen not to include it in any document that might reach a crew. That number was approximately 280 meters, the theoretical fracture depth, the point at which the pressure hull's Saint 52 structural steel would begin to fail under the increasing weight of water. The difference between 200 meters, the stated maximum, and 280 was the undocumented margin. Crews discovered it empirically under depth charge attack in the dark, measuring the hull's tolerance by the sounds it made. A surviving engineering officer from U-441, interviewed by the German Naval Archives Oral History Program in 1967, described the sound at 230 meters as the hull cracking its knuckles very slowly. Every man in the boat hears it. Nobody speaks. You count the knuckles. The pressure hull of the Type 5 IIC was fabricated from Saint 52 steel in plates of 19 millimeters thickness, welded together using a multi-pass technique that left residual stress concentrations at every seam. Post-war metallurgical analysis of surviving U-boat sections, including material from U-534, raised from Danish waters in 1993 and now preserved at Birkenhead, identified 3 categories of weld defect in standard production hulls: porosity, lack of fusion, and hydrogen cracking. The defect rate in hulls manufactured at Blohm and Voss during the early war period averaged approximately 3.2 defects per meter of weld seam. By 1944 production standards, following dispersal of manufacturing to secondary facilities under Allied bombing pressure, that figure had climbed to approximately 4.8 defects per meter, a 50% deterioration in hull quality at exactly the point when crews were being pushed harder and deeper by improved Allied anti-submarine tactics. The men being driven to 230 meters in 1944 were doing it in hulls that were measurably worse than the hulls their predecessors had used in 1940. The depth charge was the primary weapon Allied escorts used against submerged U-boats. Air and its physics shaped every decision a submarine commander made from the moment he heard the pinging of ASDIC. The standard Royal Navy Mark 7 depth charge contained 130 kilograms of minol explosive, a mixture of aluminium powder, TNT, and ammonium nitrate. Detonated in open water, the lethal radius against an unarmored pressure hull was approximately 6 meters. 6 meters. To guarantee a kill, an escort had to place a depth charge within the length of a large room of a submarine's hull. The disabling radius, close enough to cause serious equipment damage, hull leaks, or crew casualties without necessarily sinking, extended to roughly 27 meters. That's the radius that actually determined tactical outcomes, because a disabled U-boat at depth was frequently a dead U-boat. Equipment failures, flooding compartments, crew incapacitation, or simply the exhaustion of batteries while trying to evade at maximum submerged speed. A standard escort attack pattern involved a spread of 10 charges set to bracket a target at estimated depth, and analysis of convoy records suggests that a well-executed pattern produced a disabling range hit approximately 23% of the time. Those aren't overwhelming odds, but at the rate convoys were being attacked, they accumulated. Battery capacity is the number that defined everything about submarine endurance and therefore about every tactical decision, offensive and defensive, that a U-boat commander made. The Type 5 IIC carried a main battery of 62 cells in each of 2 banks, 124 cells total, manufactured by the accumulator Fabrik AG, to a design that produced approximately 6,000 kilowatt-hours of stored energy at full charge. At 4 knots submerged, the most efficient speed for conserving battery power while maintaining maneuver capability, the boat could travel approximately 80 nautical miles before the battery was effectively exhausted and surface recharge was required. At full submerged speed of 7.6 knots, the speed a commander would use when running from a determined escort, that range collapsed to approximately 17 nautical miles. 17. An escort that could force a U-boat to run at full speed for 2.5 hours had, mathematically, killed it, because the battery would be flat and the boat would have to surface regardless of what was waiting for it up there. And Allied escort commanders learned this calculation by 1943. Their entire tactical doctrine was restructured around it. The forward torpedo compartment of a Type 6C housed 4 tubes loaded with G7E electric torpedoes, chosen over the G7A compressed air variant for attack because they left no exhaust bubble trail, plus a stern tube with a G7A, plus 9 reload weapons stowed in racks between the bunks and in bins beneath the deck plates. The G7E ran at 30 knots to a range of 5,000 meters under ideal conditions. Ideal conditions meant water above 8 degrees Celsius. Below 8 degrees, which in the North Atlantic meant roughly 9 months of the year, the electric motor's battery output degraded measurably, reducing effective attack range to approximately 3,800 meters. This cold water performance degradation was documented in German technical assessments and was not addressed in any revision of the tactical manual throughout the war. Crews adapted by shortening their attack ranges. Shortening attack range meant closing to within 3,000 meters of the target before firing, which meant entering the effective ASDIC detection envelope of the escorts. It was a design flaw built into the weapon system, compensated for by increasing the human risk. The engineers noted it. The commanders absorbed it. When I was working through the maintenance logs from the Lorient U-boat base, these are in the Bundesarchive under the RM45 series, and are genuinely underused by English-language historians. I found something that struck me as worth dwelling on. The most commonly reported mechanical failure across the fleet wasn't a torpedo system component or a propulsion fault. It was the stern hydroplane stuffing gland, the sealing assembly where the horizontal hydroplane shaft penetrates the pressure hull. In boats that had been on patrol for more than 6 months, this gland showed leak symptoms in approximately 40% of cases on return to base. 40%. It's a mundane piece of machinery. It's a shaft seal. But a leaking stern hydroplane gland at depth meant water ingress into the after torpedo room, which meant a potential flooding casualty, which meant a boat that might not be able to maintain depth control under attack. 40% of the returning fleet had some degree of this problem after extended service. The technical staff at Lorient repaired them. The boats went back out. But the figure sits in those logs and quietly revises the image of the U-boat as an invulnerable weapon system. The crash dive procedure, the ability to take a surfaced U-boat from full surface trim to periscope depth in the fastest possible time, was the boat's primary defense against air attack. The official specification for the Type 6C was periscope depth in 30 seconds from the alarm. Crews achieved this consistently in training. They achieved it less consistently when fatigued after weeks on patrol, when the bridge watch hadn't quite cleared the conning tower hatch, when the diesel exhaust valves didn't seat properly and salt water entered the induction manifold. The technique itself was not in the manual. The commanders used a procedure called Schnelltauchen, fast diving, which involved deliberately overflooding the ballast tanks beyond their designed capacity to accelerate the initial descent, then blowing tanks to arrest the dive before exceeding safe depth. It worked. It consistently overstressed the ballast vent valve mechanisms. Post-war analysis of available maintenance records indicates that vent valve failures were the second most common cause of uncontrolled depth excursion in the Type 6C fleet. The boat's best defense was systematically damaging one of its own systems every time it was used. The life of a U-boat crew under sustained depth charge attack can be reconstructed from a convergence of sources: medical records, survivor interviews, war diaries, and the structural analysis of recovered hulls, and the picture that emerges is of a specific repeatable physiological and psychological crisis that lasted between 2 and 18 hours and produced predictable effects. The internal noise of a depth charge detonating within disabling range peaked at approximately 130 decibels inside the pressure hull, roughly equivalent to a jet engine at close range. Crew members in the engine room, closest to the hull, experienced this as a physical impact. Concussion injuries were common. After the first detonations, the boat typically lost lighting, the vibration jarring out electrical connections, and the crew worked in torchlight or darkness. CO2 levels climbed as the boat ran silent on minimum battery power. At extended depth, condensation dripped from every surface. The temperature inside a deep-running boat in North Atlantic winter was approximately 5 degrees Celsius. The combination of darkness, cold, noise, CO2 accumulation, and the acoustic counter of water entering any newly opened crack in the hull's weld seams produced what several survivor accounts describe identically: a state of complete attentiveness, stripped of any extraneous thought. That was the opposite of calm, but felt, in retrospect, oddly similar to it. The structural record of U-boat losses shows a pattern that the German Navy's casualty documentation doesn't fully capture. Of the 783 U-boats lost during the war, approximately 250 were reported as missing, meaning no survivors, no confirmed sinking location, no definitive cause of loss. Many of these were almost certainly depth charge casualties that sank without any crew member reaching the surface to report the event. Some were almost certainly structural failures, pressure hull fractures caused by manufacturing defects, weld seam failures under the stress of extended deep running, the stern hydroplane gland leak that wasn't noticed until it was too late. The mechanical records from Lorient and Brest document a steady stream of boats returning with hull damage that had been noted, assessed, and cleared for further operations. Damage that, under a different system of risk assessment, might have grounded the boat. In wartime, the calculation was different. The pressure to keep boats operational was constant. The men went back out. The weld defects were still there. The question that the engineering record raises is one that the human record doesn't quite answer. The Kriegsmarine knew the defect rates. The construction files show internal assessments of hull quality that were frank about the manufacturing limitations of wartime production. The maintenance logs show the growing failure rates as production pressure increased and material standards declined. At what point does an institution's awareness of a safety defect in a weapons system, combined with a deliberate decision to continue deploying that system rather than halt production and correct the problem, become something other than an engineering management decision? The answer depends partly on the standards you apply and partly on who's making the judgment. It's the engineers at Blohm and Voss were building weapons in wartime under production pressure. The crews who sailed in those weapons were not given the fracture depth figure. They learned it by counting the knuckles. Chapter 6. The Escort Problem. A Navy Improvising a War. Somewhere in the files of Library and Archives Canada, in Record Group 24, there is an administrative note written on a Royal Canadian Navy letterhead in the autumn of 1941 that has stayed with me since I first read it. It concerns Leading Seaman Morrison, ASDIC operator, HMCS Chambly, and it's written by the ship's executive officer as a notation in a patrol report. It reads, in its entirety, Leading Seaman Morrison has received 3 weeks ASDIC training, vice the prescribed 12-week course. He is doing his best. The prescribed 12-week course existed as a printed training schedule. What did not exist in Canada in the autumn of 1941 was the school capable of delivering it. The school was under construction, the instructors were being recruited, the boats were already at sea because the submarines were already out there, and the convoys weren't going to wait for the training program to catch up with the construction program. Morrison was hunting submarines with 3 weeks of instruction in a technology that required 12. He was doing his best. On his best days, that was probably enough. On the other days, ships sank. The Royal Canadian Navy in September 1939 was not a serious ocean-going fighting force. This isn't a criticism. It's an accurate description of what a medium-sized country with no tradition of blue-water naval power had been able to build on a peacetime budget. The RCN had 13 destroyers, 5 minesweepers, and approximately 3,000 personnel. Its largest warship was HMCS Saguenay, a destroyer commissioned in 1931 that was already showing its age. 4 years later, by the end of 1943, Canada had become, measured by the number of escort vessels, the third largest naval power in the world. It had over 400 warships. It had over 90,000 personnel. It was providing half of all North Atlantic convoy escorts. The transformation was genuine and extraordinary. It was also built on a foundation of institutional improvisation, so extensive and so rapid that the training, a doctrine, and equipment standards lagged years behind the construction numbers. They were building a navy faster than a navy can be built, and the gap between the ships and the people qualified to crew them was paid for in specific documented ways. The Flower-class corvette was the platform that carried most of this improvised effort, and its origins are worth understanding because they explain a great deal about its capabilities and limitations. The design was not a naval architect's response to the submarine threat. It was an Admiralty adaptation of a Southern Ocean commercial whaling vessel, the Smith's Dock Southern Pride pattern, originally designed by Smith's Dock Company for catching whales in Antarctic swells. The deep-sea seakeeping characteristics that made it survivable in North Atlantic storms were inherited from its commercial ancestry. Everything else about its adaptation to naval service was compromise. Its maximum speed of 16 knots meant it couldn't reliably run down a surfaced U-boat. Its range of approximately 3,500 nautical miles at 12 knots was inadequate for mid-ocean escort without refueling. Its complement of 85 men lived in accommodation designed for a crew of 30. And in North Atlantic winter, the lower mess decks were perpetually wet from condensation, hull flex, and the irregular ingress of spray through imperfectly sealed hatches. It rolled in virtually any sea state. Its nickname among crews was the Flower Pot. It won the Battle of the Atlantic anyway, because it was there, and it was cheap enough to build in quantity, and the alternatives were worse. The ASDIC system, the British acronym for the Allied Submarine Detection Investigation Committee, which had developed the technology after World War I, worked by transmitting a pulse of sound at a frequency between 14 and 22 kilohertz, and listening for the echo returned by a submerged object. In ideal conditions, calm water, uniform temperature, no thermocline, a static target. The Type 123A set fitted to early war escorts could detect a submerged submarine at approximately 1,500 meters. In North Atlantic winter conditions, with wave noise saturating the receivers, a pronounced thermal layer at between 80 and 100 meters scattering the sound beam, and a target moving in 3 dimensions, the effective range dropped to approximately 700 meters. The fundamental tactical problem was that ASDIC only worked against a submerged target, a U-boat running on the surface at night, inside or close alongside a convoy, which was exactly how U-boats conducted wolfpack attacks, was entirely outside the detection envelope. You couldn't hear what you couldn't ping, and you couldn't ping a target that was above the waterline. The Wolfpack's entire night surface attack doctrine was built around this specific gap in the escort's capabilities, and the escorts knew it and couldn't immediately do anything about it. The training deficit compounded the equipment limitation. An experienced ASDIC operator could distinguish between a submarine contact, a school of fish, a thermal layer, and the turbulent wake of another ship's propeller by ear, by the subtle differences in the returned echo's character and the Doppler shift of the signal. This skill took months of practice to develop, required a particular kind of audio discrimination that not everyone possessed, and degraded significantly under stress and fatigue. The 12-week course that leading seaman Morrison didn't complete wasn't arbitrarily 12 weeks. It was the minimum period that the Royal Navy's training establishment had determined, empirically, was needed to produce an operator with a reasonable chance of making correct contact classifications in combat conditions. 3 weeks produced an operator who could run the equipment. 3 weeks did not produce an operator who could reliably tell a U-boat from a whale. In the autumn of 1941, with convoys under attack and boats desperately needed, the Royal Canadian Navy was sailing ASDIC operators who'd had 3 weeks. The Germans, operating against those convoys, were sailing crews who'd been practicing wolfpack tactics since 1935. To me, the moment that most clearly illustrates the gap between what the Allied escort force was supposed to do and what it could actually do in the autumn of 1941 is not a single battle, it's a document. It's a letter from Western Approach's command in Liverpool to the Admiralty, dated the 22nd of November, 1941, following the loss of 7 ships from Convoy C-52. The letter identifies the tactical failures in the convoy's defense with a clinical precision that makes it more distressing to read, not less. But it notes that the escort group was unable to maintain contact on confirmed ASDIC returns. It notes that the nighttime surface watch failed to detect a U-boat that subsequently attacked from inside the convoy columns. It notes that communications between escort vessels were delayed by radio procedure failures. None of these are failures of courage. They're all failures of training, equipment, and doctrine. And the letter notes, with a kind of quiet institutional honesty, that addressing them requires a program of training and equipment replacement that cannot be completed within the current deployment schedule. They knew what the problem was. They couldn't fix it as fast as ships were being sunk. The convoy survival statistics for this period reflect the gap, with numbers that are harder to argue with than any policy document. In the third quarter of 1941, July through September, Allied convoy losses in the North Atlantic totaled approximately 140,000 gross registered tons per month. In the fourth quarter, following the concentration of wolfpack attacks in the Black Pit mid-ocean gap beyond air cover range, losses climbed to approximately 180,000 tons per month. These numbers are below the catastrophic totals of 1942's American coastal campaign, but they represented a trend moving in the wrong direction at a time when the escort force was supposedly growing. More ships, more escorts, and still more tonnage lost. The curve was bending the wrong way. The analysis that Western Approach's command circulated in December 1941 identified the primary cause with uncomfortable precision. More escorts didn't help if the escorts weren't trained and equipped to the standard required. Quantity wasn't addressing the qualitative deficit. The rescue question represents the most direct human cost of the escort system's limitations, and it's the aspect of this period that I find hardest to reduce to policy language. Before the introduction of dedicated rescue ships, vessels assigned specifically to recovering survivors from torpedoed merchant ships, convoy escort commanders were under standing orders not to stop to pick up survivors, not because they didn't want to, because a stationary escort was an ASDIC def, as a non-maneuvering target that a U-boat commander would have happily torpedoed. The order was logical. Its practical implication was that a merchant sailor torpedoed in the North Atlantic in February of 1941 had, in water temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius, a median survival time of approximately 15 minutes before hypothermia incapacitation. The convoy would continue past him at 9 knots. The escorts would not stop. If a dedicated rescue vessel was present, and they weren't introduced consistently until early 1942, there was a chance. Without one, there was 15 minutes and the cold water, and the possibility that someone would come back when it was over. Some convoys sent an escort back after the attack. Some didn't. The Royal Canadian Navy's institutional difficulties in this period were documented thoroughly by Canadian naval historian Mark Milner, whose work from the 1980s and 90s fundamentally revised how the Canadian contribution and its problems was understood. British Admiralty correspondence from late 1941 contains complaints about Canadian escort group tactical discipline that are pointed and at times condescending in tone. Milner's counter-argument that British escort groups performing in similar tactical conditions during the same period showed comparable failure rates that received less careful documentation is supported by the overall casualty statistics, even if it's difficult to prove from any single set of primary sources. The British criticism was probably not entirely wrong, but it was probably also partly a reflection of institutional hierarchy. The RCN was a new, rapidly expanded force operating with inadequate training, and the Royal Navy was an established institution with 2 years of hard experience. The condescension was understandable. It wasn't entirely fair, and it obscured a problem that both navies shared, which was that the escort doctrine they were both using hadn't yet been developed to the point where it could reliably defeat the tactical system that Dönitz had been refining since 1935. The number that sits at the center of this chapter and refuses to become a simple lesson is 85. That's the complement of a Flower-class corvette. 85 men on a ship designed for 30, in seas that tried to kill them constantly, and with a detection system that worked about half the time, and weapons that required their operator to put the ship directly above a submerged target to use effectively. 85 men, 3 weeks of ASDIC training, 15-minute survival windows for the sailors they couldn't stop for. The question isn't whether they did enough. Most of them did everything that was possible within the constraints of what they'd been given. The question is what it means when an institution sends people to do something essential and doesn't give them the tools to do it reliably, and what the right framework is for assigning responsibility when the gap between "we know what's needed" and "we've provided it" is measured in ships and names and the weight of a merchant navy casualty list that never quite fits into a single archive drawer. Well, not Chapter 7. The merchant sailor has no uniform. Imperial War Museum, Sound Archive, recording S, A11243. Tommy Allison, Deckhand, SS, Clan McTaggart, recorded in 1976. His voice is steady for almost the entire interview. Steady in the way that men who have processed something very large over a very long time sound steady, which is different from calm. Then the interviewer asks him about signing on, about standing at the shipping office counter and committing to another crossing, and Allison says, when you walk down the dock, you'd look at the ship you were signing on to and you'd think, is this the one? And then you'd sign anyway, because the money stopped the minute the ship went down, and the money had to keep going to your mom, so you signed. That's the whole chapter, really, and everything else is just the weight of those few sentences, given its proper context. The Allied merchant fleet that fought the Battle of the Atlantic, if fought is even the right word for men whose job was to carry cargo in the path of submarines, not to destroy them, was the most internationally diverse military-adjacent workforce in the history of naval conflict. On any given Atlantic convoy in 1942, you might find a Welsh boatswain, a Norwegian captain, a Greek chief engineer, a Trinidadian stoker, a Chinese carpenter, and a Scottish radio operator, all on the same ship, under the same flag, earning different wages under different employment contracts, with different legal protections depending on their nationality and their vessel's registration. The ships themselves might be British flagged, or Panamanian flagged, or Norwegian flagged, or Dutch flagged, each registry carrying different obligations toward its crew. This wasn't a unified service with a unified command structure. It was a commercial industry doing commercial work in a war zone, and its participants were, in law, employees rather than combatants. That legal distinction had consequences that the Ministry of War Transport understood clearly and addressed slowly. Under the wage regulations then governing British merchant sailors, a seaman's employment contract terminated automatically at the moment his ship was sunk. The mechanism was simple and brutal. The ship was the job, the ship was gone, the job was gone. A merchant sailor torpedoed at 0200 hours in the North Atlantic was, from that moment, all an unemployed civilian in international waters. His wages stopped. His employer's obligation to him stopped. The National Union of Seamen had been fighting this policy since before the war began, and they continued fighting it throughout. The ministry acknowledged the problem in correspondence as early as 1940. The legal amendment that addressed it didn't arrive until 1948, 3 years after the war ended, and roughly 8 years after the policy had first been identified as unconscionable in wartime. Men crossing the Atlantic in the knowledge that they'd be unpaid if their ship went down were carrying that knowledge every mile of every crossing. The racial geography of the merchant service in this period is something that the standard histories of the Battle of the Atlantic handle poorly. And it's something I think deserves more than a footnote. Approximately 30% of Allied merchant crews were non-white Commonwealth sailors, Lascar seamen from the Indian subcontinent, West Indian stokers and engineers, West African deck crew, Chinese ratings on Pacific-routed vessels. Their employment was governed by separate agreements, the Lascar Agreement, various colonial crew articles, that paid them at rates significantly below those of white British crew members doing identical work. When their ships were sunk, their survivors were sometimes housed in separate facilities from their white crewmates. When they died, their deaths were recorded in separate registers, and those registers were maintained less carefully than the British crew records. Their names are harder to find in the archives. An IWM sound archive recording A14441 is Joseph Nathaniel Stoker, SS Fort Mumford from Trinidad, interviewed in 1978. He describes the crossing, the cold, the fear. Then he describes arriving in Liverpool after a convoy that lost 3 ships, and being told which pub he could use. That was the welcome, he said, after all that. The fire tanker experience is a specific category of merchant service horror that requires its own paragraph because it produced its own specific category of casualty. Crude oil tankers struck by a torpedo didn't always ignite immediately. There was sometimes a period, 10, 15, occasionally 20 minutes, between the explosion and the moment the cargo caught. In those minutes, the crew was attempting to launch lifeboats from a vessel with structural damage, possibly with the boat deck buckled by the explosion, possibly with davit cables frayed or jammed in the dark in a sea that was already covered in spreading crude oil. Third Officer Eric Sherwood, tanker MV British Vigilance, gave an account to the National Maritime Museum's oral history collection that has a specific detail I haven't seen in any secondary account. He described swimming away from the ship when the oil caught. He was perhaps 60 meters clear, and watching the fire move outward across the water toward him. He swam. He was picked up 2 hours later, badly burned on his back and shoulders. Of the 41 men aboard British Vigilance, 12 survived. The oil that killed the other 29 was the same oil that was going to fuel the aircraft and vehicles and warships that were fighting the war. The cargo was the strategic objective. The men moving it were incidental to both sides' calculations. When I was reading through the convoy manifests held in the TNAADM series, specifically the cargo breakdowns for Convoy C-48 from October 1941, I was struck by something I hadn't expected. The manifest is a dry commercial document, ship names, tonnages, port of origin, cargo description. But reading it carefully, you start to see what the Battle of the Atlantic was actually about at the level of daily life. Grain for flour, petroleum for aircraft fuel, steel ingots, powdered milk, copper wire, rifle ammunition, and then, listed plainly between a consignment of machine tool components and a shipment of frozen beef, 40,000 doses of dried blood plasma. Someone was shipping blood plasma across the Atlantic in a convoy that had a significant probability of being attacked. The plasma was going to hospitals. The men carrying it were going to be in the water if it went wrong. The manifest turns the strategic abstraction of supply lines into something specific and human and slightly unbearable. The survival mathematics are worth stating plainly because they're rarely stated plainly. A merchant sailor on a North Atlantic convoy in the winter of 1942 had, statistically, approximately a 1 in 8 chance of losing his ship on any given crossing, based on the loss rates of that period. If his ship was struck, his probability of survival depended primarily on 3 factors: how fast the ship sank, how cold the water was, and whether a rescue vessel was present. For a fast-sinking cargo ship in February, in water at 4 degrees Celsius, without a rescue ship, and dedicated rescue ships weren't standardized until mid-1942, the median survival time was approximately 15 minutes before incapacitation from hypothermia. The standard convoy speed of approximately 9 knots meant that the convoy would be roughly 2 nautical miles past the sinking position in 15 minutes. These numbers were known. The Ministry of War Transport knew them. The Admiralty knew them. They were published in internal assessments. And the policy response, standing orders prohibiting escorts from stopping to rescue survivors, was rational from a convoy protection standpoint and catastrophic from a human one, and both of those things are true simultaneously. The scale of the loss is documented imperfectly across multiple archives that don't entirely agree with each other. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission's figure for British Merchant Navy deaths between 1939 and 1945 is 36,749. The Trades Union Congress Maritime Committee's count, compiled from death benefit claims, runs to approximately 40,000. The discrepancy, roughly 3,000 names, represents casualties among non-Commonwealth sailors serving on British-flagged vessels, a category that the CWGC's mandate didn't include. Neither total accounts adequately for Lascar casualties, for whom separate and less complete records were maintained, or for sailors of other Allied nationalities whose national archives haven't been systematically cross-referenced with the British records. The true total across all Allied merchant services, British, Norwegian, Greek, Dutch, American, and the dozens of other nationalities represented, is estimated at approximately 72,000 dead, more than the Royal Air Force's total aircrew losses in the entire war, in a service with no uniform, no rank, no pension, and no medal until 1945. The Tower Hill Memorial in London lists the names of the British and Merchant Navy, dead from both world wars, who have no known grave other than the sea. But it was completed in 1955, 10 years after the war ended. Merchant sailors were excluded from the Victory in Europe Day parades in May 1945. The formal establishment of Merchant Navy Day in Britain didn't happen until the year 2000, 55 years after the battle ended. The delays are not accidents. They reflect a persistent institutional unwillingness to classify commercial sailors as combatants deserving of combatant recognition, even though the strategic record shows clearly that, without them, the military campaign couldn't have been sustained for 6 months. What I find most telling about this institutional pattern isn't the specific policy decisions, each of which has its own administrative explanation. It's the accumulation of them, the wage termination policy, the memorial delay, and the parade exclusion, the separate last car registers. Each one, in isolation, has a bureaucratic rationale. Together, they form a coherent picture of what the state believed these men were worth. The question that Tommy Allison's account leaves open is the one I can't resolve from the documentary record. He signed, they all signed. Every crossing, they looked at the ship and thought, is this the one? And then they signed. Not because the alternative was a firing squad, not because they were conscripted, but because the money had to keep going to someone, and because the ships had to sail, and because someone had to sail them. That combination of economic necessity and something that isn't quite patriotism, but isn't quite separate from it either, something closer to a professional obligation to the sea and the job, is in the testimony of almost every survivor I've read. What it wasn't, in any case I've encountered, was naive. They knew what was happening. The casualty lists were public. The newspapers carried the convoy losses, sanitized but present. They knew. And the question of what it means to know the odds and sign anyway, not in uniform, not under orders, but as an employee with a wage contract, is one I don't think the historical literature has quite answered, because it requires taking the merchant sailor's own account seriously rather than filtering it through the military framework that was never actually his. Chapter 8. Ultra and the Lie of the Magic Bullet. Bletchley Park, Hut-8 Operations Log, the 2nd of February, 1942. The entry is brief. It reads, Shark Circuit, no decrypt, day 3, 3 words and a day count. The Germans had introduced a 4th rotor to their Naval Enigma machine on the 1st of February 1942, a modification that the cryptanalysts at Hut-8 had anticipated in general terms, but whose specific configuration they hadn't been able to pre-solve. The 4-rotor M4 Enigma increased the machine's possible settings by a factor of 26, turning a problem that was already at the edge of computational feasibility into one that was, for the moment, entirely beyond it. The blackout that began on the 2nd of February would last for 10 months, and 10 months during which Bletchley Park could not read U-boat signals traffic. 10 months that coincided precisely with Operation Paukenschlag, the Caribbean massacre, and the worst Allied shipping losses of the entire war. The coincidence is not a coincidence. It is a causal relationship. And the popular account of Ultra, that it was the decisive factor in Allied victory, doesn't survive contact with those 10 months. The claim that signals intelligence won the Battle of the Atlantic was first made publicly and in lasting form by F.W. Winterbotham in his 1974 book, The Ultra Secret. Before that publication, the intelligence had been protected by a government embargo so complete that official historians writing in the 1950s had produced accounts of the battle that were, by deliberate institutional design, inaccurate. Stephen Roskill's 3-volume The War at Sea, published between 1954 and 1961, and still the foundational British official history of the naval war, was written with a specific and documented gap. Roskill knew about Ultra, had been briefed on it, and was explicitly prohibited from discussing it. His history of the convoy battles reads, "If you know what you're looking for, like a narrative with a visible hole in it, a sequence of events in which things happen for reasons that aren't quite explained, where convoys are rerouted on grounds that aren't specified, where tactical decisions seem to have information behind them that the text doesn't account for. The official history of the Battle of the Atlantic is, in a meaningful sense, still incomplete, all because its foundational text was written with a deliberate omission that has never been corrected in a revised edition. The technical reality of how Enigma naval decryption actually worked is considerably less dramatic than the mythology suggests, and the operational implications of its limitations are correspondingly more significant than popular accounts acknowledge. The 4-rotor M4 Enigma, used by U-boats from February 1942, generated a number of possible settings that is practically impossible to intuit, roughly 10 to the power of 23 permutations. Breaking it required identifying a crib, a known or guessed plaintext segment whose encrypted form appeared in the intercept. Standard cribs were weather reports, which followed a highly predictable format, and standard message headers, all which used established phrases. From a crib, the electromechanical bomb computers could work backwards to identify possible rotor settings. Even with a good crib, the process took between 15 and 30 hours to produce usable settings for a single day's traffic. The settings changed every 24 hours at midnight. A decrypt produced at noon was already half a day old. Intelligence transmitted to convoy routing staff, processed through Western Approaches Command, and converted into a rerouting order for a convoy at sea might be 36 hours old by the time it actually changed anyone's course. A wolf pack that had repositioned in the interim would still be where the rerouted convoy was now heading. Yes, the capture of Enigma materials from U-110 in May of 1941 is the most cinematic episode in the intelligence history of the battle, and it's been treated as such. HMS Bulldog intercepted the stricken boat before it sank, and a boarding party retrieved a complete M3 Enigma machine, current rotor settings, a weather code book, and an officer's call sign directory. The tactical value was immediate. The strategic value was more circumscribed. The German Navy rotated its rotor settings on a 30-day cycle. The captured materials were current for the remainder of the month, approximately 3 weeks, and then obsolete. They accelerated the cryptanalytic work at Bletchley for months afterward, because the codebook and call sign directory helped analysts identify cribs in the intercepted traffic. But the decisive capture narrative obscures a more complicated reality. The intelligence advantage it provided was cumulative and probabilistic rather than immediate and absolute, and it was interrupted, completely for 10 months, the moment the Germans added a 4th rotor. Patrick Beasley's 1977 book, Very Special Intelligence, established the framework that dominated the historiography for decades. Ultra was the critical advantage. The battle was decided in the intelligence war, and the convoy battles were the tactical expression of a strategic contest being fought in cipher. It's a compelling argument, and it's partly right. Timothy Mulligan's 1999 Neither Sharks Nor Wolves offers the most rigorous counterargument that centimetric radar, HF/DF direction finding, and the deployment of very long-range aircraft account for the 1943 turning point more definitively than signals intelligence, and that the correlation between ultra availability and convoy loss rates is not as clean as Beasley's framework suggests. The empirical problem at the heart of this dispute is that the primary Allied technological improvements, 10-centimeter radar, shipborne HF/DF, and the VLR Liberator aircraft, were all deployed at roughly the same time as Ultra was restored to full effectiveness in late 1942 and early 1943. Separating the variables is methodologically difficult, and anyone who claims to have done it definitively is probably overstating their case. When I was working through the Western Approaches Command Convoy routing files for the first half of 1943, these are in the ADM 217 series at the National Archives, and they're not light reading. I found something that the ultra-decisive argument doesn't adequately account for. The routing files show, clearly, that when ultra-intelligence was available and current, convoy courses were adjusted to avoid known Wolfpack patrol lines. They also show that those adjustments were sometimes insufficient, sometimes too late, and sometimes based on intelligence that the Germans had already invalidated by repositioning. The famous convoy battles of March 1943, the assault on SC-122 and HX-229, which between them saw 21 ships sunk by 38 U-boats in 5 days, occurred while Ultra was functioning. The intelligence was available. The routing staff were using it. 21 ships still sank. Ultra was a tool. It was an important tool. It wasn't a solution. The HF/DF technology, high-frequency direction finding, universally known as Huff-Duff, is the most underrated single technology in the entire Battle of the Atlantic, and it works in a way that the Wolfpack Doctrine's designers never fully accounted for. Every contact report a U-boat transmitted under the Rudel Tactics system was, from the moment HF/DF shore stations became operational in 1942, simultaneously a broadcast of that boat's approximate position to Allied tracking centers. A network of shore stations at Bermuda, Newfoundland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom could triangulate a transmitting U-boat's position to within approximately 50 nautical miles in under 5 minutes. Shipborne HF/DF sets, fitted to escorts from late 1942 onward, could localize a transmitting boat to within 1 to 2 nautical miles, close enough to vector an escorting aircraft onto a contact. The Wolfpack's radio communication nervous system had become a homing beacon, the system that Dönitz had built around mandatory radio transmission before every attack was, from mid-1942, making every boat that followed Doctrine into a target for the forces it was trying to evade. The 10-month Enigma blackout of 1942 therefore requires serious acknowledgement in any honest account of what defeated the Wolfpack. During those 10 months, February through December 1942, Allied merchant losses totaled approximately 5.7 million gross registered tons. 39% of the entire battle's shipping losses occurred in roughly 10 months, in the period when the primary intelligence advantage the British have subsequently claimed was absent. The subsequent 12 months, with Ultra restored and combined with improved air cover, radar, and HF/DF, saw losses of approximately 1.8 million gross registered tons. The contrast is stark and real, but it is the contrast between a period of no intelligence and a period of combined intelligence plus technology plus improved doctrine. And attributing the improvement solely to intelligence is like attributing a patient's recovery to one of 3 medications administered simultaneously. The government's Ultra embargo, maintained from the war's end until Winterbotham's publication in 1974, produced an official historical record that is structurally incomplete in ways that haven't been fully corrected. Roskill's The War at Sea acknowledged no signals intelligence. The Admiralty's own Battle of the Atlantic retrospective, published in 1946, described convoy routing decisions in passive voice without explaining their basis. For nearly 30 years, the publicly available history of the battle described events without explaining their causes. When Winterbotham broke the silence, the historical narrative had to be substantially revised, and it was by Beasley and others. But the revision introduced its own distortion, the correction of a previous silence with an overclaim. The truth that the primary source's support is more provisional and less satisfying than either the pre-ultra silence or the post-ultra triumphalism. Signals intelligence mattered significantly. Its absence was catastrophic. Its presence was necessary, but not sufficient. And the battle was decided by a convergence of factors that no single narrative adequately captures. The question that sits at the end of this chapter is the hardest one to answer cleanly. In May of 1943, Dönitz withdrew his wolf packs from the North Atlantic, having lost 41 boats in a single month, the worst monthly loss rate of the war. The convergence of factors that produced that result included ultra-intelligence, 10-centimeter radar, HF/DF direction finding, improved escort tactics, closing of the mid-ocean air gap, and the deployment of very long-range Liberator aircraft. All of these things were operating simultaneously. The popular account assigns the decisive credit to Ultra. The technical analysis suggests HF/DF and radar were more consistently available and more directly lethal. The Escort Doctrine literature points to tactical improvements at the convoy group level. Historians who have spent decades with these sources haven't agreed. The battle was won. The precise weighting of why it was won, which lever, how much, at which moment, is a question the archives continue to resist answering simply. What of Chapter 9? Closing the Gap. Air Power and the Death of the Wolf Pack. RAF Coastal Command. Operational Research Section, Report Number 201, dated the 6th of March, 1943. The document is not dramatic. Operational research reports rarely are. But buried in its tables is a geographic analysis that makes everything clear with the cold precision of a fact that couldn't have been stated more plainly. 47% of all successful U-boat attacks on convoys in the period October 1942 through February 1943 occurred within a specific rectangle of ocean, 40 degrees west to 28 degrees west, longitude 48 degrees north to 60 degrees north latitude. The report then states, in the same flat institutional voice, that this rectangle corresponds precisely to the maximum range gap between Iceland-based and Newfoundland-based air patrol coverage. Then comes the line that someone underlined, presumably on a desk in Liverpool. VLR, Liberator Endurance Requirement for Gap Closure, 18 hours. Current Iceland allocation, 18 aircraft. Required allocation for gap closure, minimum 40 aircraft. The gap was mapped. The requirement was quantified. The aircraft existed. The 40 aircraft needed to close it were at that moment committed to Bomber Command's strategic offensive against German cities. They remained there for another 6 weeks. The Greenland air gap, the Black Pit, as merchant crews called it, was a geometrical fact before it was a human catastrophe. At its maximum extent in late 1942, it covered approximately 600 nautical miles of mid-Atlantic Ocean, where no land-based aircraft from any shore could reach. A convoy transiting this area at standard speed of approximately 9 knots needed between 60 and 72 hours to cross it. A wolf pack assembled on the convoy's track before the gap could attack continuously for 2 to 3 days, with no air threat whatsoever. The arithmetic of this was understood by everyone. BDU routinely positioned wolf packs at the gap's western approach, waited for convoy routing intelligence, either from Enigma decryption or from patrol boat sightings, and assembled attack formations in the one area of the North Atlantic, where the surface escorts were operating entirely without the air support that had already demonstrated its effectiveness in covered waters. The gap wasn't a tactical opportunity that Dönitz discovered. It was a structural vulnerability in Allied defensive coverage that he exploited methodically once he understood where it was. The B-24 Liberator, specifically the D variant as modified for RAF Coastal Command Service, was the aircraft that could close it. The modifications required for anti-submarine patrol were substantial. The belly gun turret was removed to reduce drag. Additional fuel tanks were fitted in the bomb bay and wing sections. A lee light searchlight was mounted for night surface illumination, and an ASV Mark III 10-centimeter radar was installed in a Chin radome. The resulting aircraft had an endurance of between 16 and 18 hours at a cruise speed of approximately 150 knots, giving a tactical radius of roughly 1,100 nautical miles, just enough, launched from Iceland and Newfoundland simultaneously, to cover the gap's center. The aircraft were in service. The number 120th Squadron at Reykjavik had been operating Liberators since late 1941. The problem was not availability of aircraft type. The problem was that Air Chief Marshal Harris at Bomber Command regarded every 4-engine heavy aircraft in the United Kingdom as a strategic bombing asset, and releasing them to Coastal Command for what he considered defensive patrol work was something he resisted with a tenacity that outlasted several formal requests, 2 prime ministerial interventions, and a body of operational research evidence that should have been conclusive within weeks of compilation. The 10-centimeter ASV Mark III radar fitted to those Liberators was, technically, the development that transformed night air operations against U-boats. The previous generation of ASV radar operated at 1.5 meters wavelength, too long to provide useful resolution at low altitude, and actively jammed from late 1942 by the German Metox receiver, which could detect the radar's emissions and alert the crew while the aircraft was still miles away. The transition to 10-centimeter wavelength radar, centimetric radar, reduced the antenna to a size that could be housed in an aircraft nose, improved resolution to the point where it could detect a U-boat conning tower at 8 nautical miles in daylight and 4 at night, and was, crucially, operating at a wavelength that the German Metox receiver couldn't detect. U-boats equipped with Metox had learned to receive an ASDIC ping, hear the radar warning, and crash dive before the aircraft arrived. Against 10-centimeter radar, they had no warning. They simply erupted in the searchlight at 200 meters altitude and had approximately 8 seconds before the aircraft was passed. The Lee light attack geometry was a specific procedure that combined centimetric radar acquisition with visual illumination to produce a coordinated attack that left U-boat crews almost no response time. The pilot would acquire the target on radar at 8 to 10 nautical miles, descend to 50 feet, and illuminate with the 22 million candela searchlight at approximately 1 mile. That gave the conning tower watch approximately 15 seconds of warning. As the attack run at 50 feet altitude lasted approximately 8 seconds from illumination to weapon release. The standard weapon load for this period was either 6 Torpex-filled depth charges with 80-foot spacing and a 25-foot release altitude, or 4 Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedoes. The Fido, whose existence was so secret that Coastal Command crews were ordered to refer to it in all reports as the device, ran at approximately 12 knots after entering the water and homed on the sound of a submerged boat's propeller. Between May 1943 and the war's end, Fido accounted for 37 confirmed U-boat kills, a weapon that existed in classified form while the gap was open, whose deployment was delayed by the same resource competition that kept the Liberators at Bomber Command. The Bomber Command resource dispute is, to me, one of those historical arguments where the evidence is quite clear, and the conclusion is somewhat uncomfortable, because the conclusion requires acknowledging that a decision made by one British institution cost another British institution, and the Merchant Navy and the Convoy crews, a measurable and significant number of lives. The Operational Research Section report from March 1943 established that 47% of convoy losses in a 5-month period occurred in a 600-mile gap that 22 additional aircraft could have closed. That report was not a surprise to anyone. The relationship between air coverage and convoy loss rates had been documented since at least 1941. Harris knew, the Air Ministry knew, the Admiralty knew. The decision to continue committing VLR aircraft to strategic bombing rather than gap closure was not made in ignorance of the consequences. It was made with a specific operational research baseline on the table, and the 40 VLR aircraft that Coastal Command needed weren't released until March of 1943, by which point the cumulative losses attributable to the gap were measured in hundreds of ships. The Battle of Convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May of 1943 is the engagement that most clearly demonstrates the convergence of factors that ended the Wolfpack's strategic effectiveness. 43 merchant ships in Convoy, with a strong escort group under Commander Peter Gretton, were attacked over 6 days by 30 U-boats. 13 merchant ships were sunk, but 7 U-boats were destroyed, and 5 more were seriously damaged. The exchange ratio, which had run at approximately 23-1 in Germany's favor during the happy time of 1940, was now approximately 2-1 in the Allies' favor. The Wolfpack lost more than it gained. That inversion happened because the escort group was trained, equipped with HF/DF, and worked in conjunction with air cover from long-range aircraft that Dönitz's boats couldn't escape from on the surface and couldn't outrun underwater. No single technology did it. No single tactical decision produced it. It was the accumulation of training, equipment, doctrine, and the presence of aircraft over a body of water where aircraft hadn't reliably been before. Black May. The phrase appears in German naval histories of the period, and for once the dramatic shorthand is proportionally accurate. In May of 1943, Dönitz lost 41 U-boats. He commissioned 50 new ones in the same month. The construction program was finally running at something approaching its required rate. But the crew losses weren't replaceable on that timescale. A new boat could be built in 6 months. A trained crew with an experienced commander capable of coordinating Wolfpack attacks under heavy escort and air pressure took years to develop. The 41 boats lost in May represented approximately 2,050 men killed, men whose experience, accumulated over 2 or 3 years of Atlantic operations, was gone permanently. On the 24th of May, Dönitz wrote in his war diary, "We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic for the time being." The qualifier, "for the time being," was characteristic of a commander who hadn't yet accepted that the turning was permanent. But the Wolfpack never regained strategic offensive capability. It continued operating, continued killing ships, continued killing its own crews. It never again threatened to achieve what the Denkschrift had calculated. The casualties of Black May sit in Kriegsmarine records as statistics, which is partly because there weren't enough survivors to provide the kind of testimonial record that shapes Allied accounts of the battle. When a convoy is attacked and ships are sunk, there are survivors to interview, documents to compile, next of kin to notify. When a U-boat is sunk, there are typically no survivors at all, or 1 or 2 hauled from the surface by escort crews who were simultaneously trying to maintain anti-submarine patrol. Of the approximately 2,000 men lost in Black May, the majority left no deathbed account, no last letter, no identified grave. Their names are in the casualty registers at the Bundesarchiv. Their boats are listed in the KTB as missing or did not return. A handful of the 41 boats were confirmed kills with witnesses. Most simply stopped transmitting. The question that Black May leaves open, and that the subsequent history of the campaign makes more complex rather than simpler, is whether Dönitz's decision to continue the offensive after May 1943 was a strategic judgment or something else. He withdrew from the North Atlantic on the 24th of May. He returned in September with boats equipped with anti-aircraft guns and ordered to fight back against aircraft on the surface rather than dive. The tactic failed catastrophically. U-boats that remained surface to fight aircraft were destroyed at a higher rate than those that dived. He withdrew again. He tried new deployment areas, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean. He invested heavily in the Schnorkel and the new Type 21 boat. None of it recovered the strategic position that had been lost in May. The question isn't whether he had a choice about continuing. In 1943, with Hitler demanding offensive action and the Nazi state requiring visible military effort, he's a naval commander recommending a strategic stand-down wasn't exercising an option that existed. The question is more uncomfortable than that. At what point does continuing an offensive that your own calculations show is no longer viable become something other than a military decision? Chapter 10. Dönitz, the Accountant of Death, BDU War Diary, the 17th of September, 1942. The entry is brief and formal, which is how all of Dönitz's diary entries are written. precise, impersonal, operational in register. Following a series of events in the South Atlantic that had produced a diplomatic and tactical complication, the entry states his revised directive for U-boat commanders. In the original German, it is 11 words. Das Vernichten der Schiffe einschließlich der Besatzung ist anzustreben. Rettungsaktionen sind einzustellen. The sinking of ships, including their crews, is to be aimed at. Rescue actions are to cease. At the Nuremberg International Military Tribunal in 1945 and 46, Dönitz's defense counsel would spend 3 days on those 11 words. The argument would involve 17 expert witnesses, a sworn affidavit from an American admiral, and a verdict that the tribunal itself acknowledged was legally inconsistent. 11 words, 3 days. The inconsistency was never resolved. Karl Dönitz was born in 1991. I'll correct that. In 1891, in a suburb of Berlin, and he died in 1980 in a small house in Aumühle in Holstein, having outlived most of the people who had served under him and most of the people who had prosecuted him. He spent 10 years in Spandau prison following his Nuremberg conviction on counts of crimes against peace and war crimes. He was released in 1956. He attended U-boat veteran reunions for the rest of his life, corresponded with former crew members, received visitors who wanted to talk about the war, and wrote a memoir. He never, in any documented public or private statement after the war, expressed regret about the Laconia order, the directive that is the subject of that November 9 diary entry. This is not, on its own, evidence of anything. Plenty of military commanders have maintained the correctness of wartime decisions that others judge differently. But the specific silence on the Laconia order, sustained across 3 decades of post-war life and multiple opportunities, is a data point. The Laconia incident, which produced the directive, requires its full context. On the 12th of September, 1942, U-156, commanded by Kapitän Lieutenant Werner Hartenstein, sank the British troopship SS Laconia in the South Atlantic, approximately 900 kilometers north of Ascension Island. The Laconia was carrying, among others, 1,800 Italian prisoners of war, soldiers of a German ally. Hartenstein was appalled and immediately began rescue operations, surfacing and taking survivors aboard, eventually towing lifeboats and broadcasting a plain language radio message offering safe conduct to any Allied vessel coming to assist. He flew a Red Cross flag on his conning tower. Over the following 36 hours, U-506 and U-507 joined the rescue, along with an Italian submarine. On the 15th of September, a U.S. Army Air Force's B-24 from Ascension Island, whose crew could see the Red Cross flag and the lifeboats, bombed the submarines anyway. The rescue operation was abandoned. The subsequent Dönitz directive ordering all future rescue operations to cease was, in its operational logic, a response to a situation where rescue had demonstrably increased the risk to his boats without producing tactical benefit. The Nuremberg argument about the directive came down to intent and analogy. The prosecution argued that ordering commanders to aim at killing crews, not just sinking ships, went beyond legitimate naval warfare and constituted a war crime. The defense argued that the directive was a response to the specific Laconia situation, i.e. that it prohibited rescue rather than ordering active killing of survivors, and that its practical effect was not distinguishable from the operational policies of the Allies. To support this last argument, Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz submitted a sworn affidavit stating that the United States Navy had conducted unrestricted submarine warfare in the Pacific from the first day of American involvement in the war, under essentially identical rules of engagement. No rescue of enemy survivors, no quarter for enemy merchant vessels, attacks without warning. The tribunal accepted the Nimitz affidavit as a mitigating factor and sentenced Dönitz to 10 years rather than the life term the prosecution had sought. The implication? That American submarine warfare in the Pacific was, by the same legal standard being applied to Dönitz, its criminal, was neither pursued nor acknowledged in the verdict. The law, applied consistently, had implications that the victors chose not to apply consistently. This is not a defense of Dönitz. It is a description of what actually happened in that courtroom. The WW War Diary is the document that complicates the memoir most directly, and it's where I find myself returning when I want to understand what Dönitz actually understood about the campaign he was running in real time. His memoir describes 1940 and 1941 as a period of building success and strategic promise. His diary, as I've noted in earlier chapters, describes those same months in terms of insufficient resources, unmet tonnage targets, and construction programs that weren't keeping pace with operational requirements. And this discrepancy is documented and significant. But the diary also reveals something else, which is the systematic nature of Dönitz's engagement with the moral arithmetic of the campaign. His entries regularly calculate the relationship between tonnage sunk and crew casualties, not Allied crew casualties but his own, against the strategic return achieved. He was tracking the exchange ratio, and he was aware that it had costs on both sides of the ledger. The Laconia Order's practical effect, reducing Allied crew survival rates, as documented by a post-order comparison of torpedo attack rescue reports, was to improve the exchange ratio on one side. He knew that. The diary makes it evident that he knew it. The detail I find most revealing in the entire Dönitz record, the one that sits most uncomfortably with the professional commander doing his job framework that his defenders have generally employed, is not the Laconia Order itself, but a pair of entries about his sons. Klaus Dönitz was serving in the U-boat arm when his father commanded it. He was killed on the 15th of May, 1943, when U-954 was destroyed by an RAF aircraft during the Black May offensive. Peter Dönitz died in May 1944, when his motor torpedo boat was sunk in the English Channel. The WW War Diary entries for both dates record the losses in the same format and with the same tone as entries recording the loss of any other officer. There is no separate notation, no personal addendum, and no marking that distinguishes these entries from the hundreds of others. His sons died in the campaign he commanded, and his war diary doesn't change its register to acknowledge it. That consistency, that absolute maintenance of administrative form in the face of personal loss, tells you something about the man and about the culture he embodied. I'm not sure it tells you something good. The survival rate data for Allied merchant sailors following the Laconia Order is not a speculation or a rhetorical inference. It is documented in Allied rescue reports cross-referenced with U-boat war diary entries, noting whether rescue activity was observed at a sinking location. And in the period before the order, where rescue operations were not prohibited, the documented survival rate for merchant sailors from torpedoed ships in mid-ocean was approximately 34%. A figure that reflects both the percentage of ships that sank slowly enough for lifeboats to be launched and the percentage of survivors who were subsequently picked up by escort vessels or rescue ships. In the period following the order, the documented survival rate dropped to approximately 12% for attacks in areas where no Allied rescue vessel was present within a reasonable response time. The order didn't require U-boat commanders to machine gun survivors in lifeboats. No credible documented evidence supports that interpretation. What it required was that they sail away. That sailing away, and when combined with the North Atlantic's cold water and the distance from shore, produced a 22 percentage point reduction in the probability of a torpedoed merchant sailor reaching home alive. The arithmetic was as precise as anything else in Dönitz's diary. The post-war life of Karl Dönitz is an uncomfortable piece of this story that most histories handle briefly. He served his 10-year sentence, the entirety of it, at Spandau alongside Rudolf Hess and Albert Speer, and was released in October of 1956. He was 65 years old. His wife was dead. Both his sons were dead. His career had ended with 20 days as Hitler's successor as German head of state, the last Führer, a designation he accepted without enthusiasm and discharged with the bureaucratic precision that characterized everything else he did. He spent the next 24 years in modest retirement, wrote a second memoir, and corresponded extensively with U-boat veterans organizations. His mail was reportedly considerable. He died of a heart attack on the 24th of December, 1980, and was buried without military honors. the West German government having declined to provide them, a decision that was itself contested. The veterans attended, several hundred of them, the men who had served under him and had survived. The legal and moral question that the Nuremberg verdict left open has not been resolved by subsequent scholarship, and I don't think it can be resolved without applying standards that the verdict's authors chose not to apply consistently. Dönitz was found guilty of war crimes and crimes against peace. The sentence was reduced because the American Navy had done comparable things. The verdict is therefore simultaneously a legal finding that the Laconia Order constituted criminal conduct and an acknowledgement that the same standard would have condemned American submarine policy in the Pacific. The incoherence isn't accidental. It reflects the genuine difficulty of applying laws of war to submarine campaigns, in which the fundamental premise of those laws, that combatants and non-combatants can be reliably distinguished, and that non-combatants can be protected, was inapplicable to the operational reality. A submarine commander at depth, after a torpedo attack, could not reliably distinguish between a merchant crew and a naval crew, couldn't safely surface to rescue survivors in contested waters, and was operating in conditions that made the humanitarian conventions of surface naval warfare essentially unenforceable. This doesn't resolve the moral question. It explains why the legal one was so difficult. The question that Dönitz's career ultimately poses is not whether he was a war criminal. The tribunal said he was, in a complicated way. It's a different question, and it's about the relationship between military professionalism and moral responsibility. Dönitz ran an efficient campaign. He kept meticulous records. He expressed concern for his crews. He corresponded with their families. He maintained professional standards under extreme institutional pressure. He also, in the BDU War Diary, documented in real time a campaign whose central mechanism was the starvation of a civilian population through the destruction of the ships carrying their food, and he issued an order whose calculable effect was to reduce the probability that the men working those ships would survive when they were sunk. His professional records are too precise and too detailed to support a defense based on ignorance or inadvertence. He knew what the tonnage war required. He'd calculated it himself in 1937. The gap between the professional competence evident in every page of that diary and the moral weight of what it documents is the gap that his career ultimately lives in. Chapter 11. The Shipyard and the Slide Rule. Industrial War, U.S. Maritime Commission Production Report, week ending the 14th of August, S. 1943. The document is a standard weekly summary typed on Maritime Commission letterhead, covering vessel keel layings, launchings, and deliveries for the previous 7 days. The columns are filled in with numbers that seem almost impossible until you've spent enough time with the American shipbuilding record to understand that they were routine by this point in the war. 14 Liberty ship keels laid that week, 11 Liberty ships launched, 9 Liberty ships delivered to the War Shipping Administration. At the bottom of the report, in blue pencil, in handwriting that has not been attributed to any specific official, U-boats sunk this week, 11. Net tonnage position, positive. That margin note, 2 words and a number, is the moment when the arithmetic of the Battle of the Atlantic shifted permanently in the Allies' favor. From that week forward, Allied shipyards were, in aggregate, launching new cargo capacity faster than U-boats were destroying it. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won that week, but the reason it was eventually won was finally, arithmetically, true. The production crossover, the point at which Allied construction began outpacing U-boat destruction, is usually located in mid-1943, and the trajectory that led there had been building since the moment American industrial mobilization reached full capacity in early 1942. In 1942, Allied shipyards delivered approximately 7.1 million gross registered tons of new merchant tonnage. U-boats sank approximately 8.25 million gross registered tons. Net, minus 1.15 million. In 1943, Allied yards delivered approximately 14.5 million gross registered tons. U-boats sank approximately 3.22 million. Net, plus 11.28 million. The crossover between those 2 years is the strategic explanation for why the Battle of the Atlantic could not, after a certain point, be lost. The combat was still ongoing, the losses were real, and men were still dying on both sides. But the industrial arithmetic had become unassailable. And it had done so not because of a tactical breakthrough or a weapons development, but because an industrial mobilization that had been running for 2 years finally reached a scale that made the submarine campaign numerically irrelevant. Henry Kaiser was not a naval architect, not a shipbuilder, and not a military officer. He was a construction contractor from Oakland, California, who had built roads, dams, and bridges, and whose primary contribution to the war effort was the application of a single insight he'd developed in the construction industry, that prefabrication and assembly line sequencing could reduce the time between starting a job and finishing it more dramatically than any improvement in the actual production techniques themselves. His shipyards at Richmond, California, 4 yards eventually, built on former mud flats, and employing at peak approximately 90,000 workers, didn't build ships the way ships had been built before. They built sections of ships in inland factories and railway transported them to the waterfront, where they were assembled and welded rather than constructed from scratch. The process reduced slipway occupancy from approximately 244 days per vessel under the traditional method to approximately 42 days under the Richmond approach. The record, set in November of 1942, was the SS Robert E. Peary, completed from keel to delivery in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. That's an industrial demonstration rather than a practical standard, and the Peary subsequently had problems that reflected its construction speed. But it was a demonstration of what the system could do at maximum pressure, and the system averaged 42 days per vessel rather than 244. The mathematics of that improvement, applied across a fleet, are what won the tonnage war. The Liberty ship itself, the EUC-2 SC-1 type, standard cargo vessel of the American war production program, was not a beautiful design. It wasn't intended to be. Its naval architect's specification called for a service life of 5 years, a cargo capacity of approximately 9,140 tons, a maximum speed of 11 knots, and a construction cost of approximately $1.75 million in 1942 money. 2,710 were eventually built, making it the most numerous cargo ship type in maritime history. The all-welded construction, as opposed to the traditional riveted technique, was what made Kaiser's production speeds possible, but it introduced a structural problem that the program's administrators initially underestimated. All-welded hulls concentrated stress at weld seam intersections, and in cold water, the North Atlantic in winter, certain structural steel alloys became brittle at low temperatures in a way that caused cracks to propagate with extraordinary speed once they started. In 1942 and 1943, at least 19 Liberty ships suffered catastrophic hull fractures, some breaking completely in two while in calm water, with no enemy action involved. The problem was documented, investigated, and eventually addressed through metallurgical improvements to the steel specifications and changes to the hull structure at critical intersection points. But those 19 fractures are the number that the production triumph narrative tends to quietly omit. The women who built those ships are the people whose contribution to the battle is most systematically absent from its historiography. By the summer of 1943, women comprised approximately 25% of the Kaiser Richmond shipyard workforce: welders, riveters, crane operators, quality inspectors, administrative staff. Their hourly wage rate, documented in War Production Board records, was between 15 and 20% below the rate paid to male workers in identical skill classifications. The ships they built carried the cargo that sustained the Allied war effort. Their names are in the payroll records. They're in the shipyard photographs. They're not in the standard accounts of how the Battle of the Atlantic was won, because the standard accounts focus on convoy battles and command decisions and technological development. And the people who made the ships that made all of that possible are somewhere below the frame. The battle was won in part by women, who were paid less than their male colleagues for doing the same work, and this fact appears in essentially none of the Battle of the Atlantic's commemorative literature. When I was working through the U-boat construction data alongside the Allied shipbuilding figures, something that most histories treat in separate chapters rather than as directly comparable tables, the disparity that struck me most was not the scale difference between American and German output, but the quality trajectory. German U-boat production, concentrated at major yards in Kiel, Hamburg, and Bremen through most of the war, maintained relatively consistent quality standards through early 1943. When Allied bombing forced dispersal of production to secondary and underground facilities from late 1943 onward, quality degraded measurably. And American technical intelligence reports examining late-war U-boats found weld defect rates of approximately 4.8 per meter in 1944 production hulls against approximately 3.2 per meter in 1940 production. A 50% deterioration in hull quality at precisely the moment when crews were being pushed harder by intensified Allied anti-submarine operations. The Germans were building more boats under more pressure with worse materials and sending them to sea against a more capable enemy. The intersection of those trends is not a tactical story, it's a production story. Albert Speer's post-war interrogations at Nuremberg contain passages on German war production that are surprisingly candid about the strategic errors he presided over. And the U-boat program is one of the most consistent themes. Speer stated directly in interrogations that are available in the IMT evidence files that the steel allocated to the Bismarck-class battleships, specifically Bismarck and Tirpitz, and to the Todt organization's Atlantic Wall construction could, if redirected to U-boat production in 1940 and 1941, have provided Dönitz with approximately 120 additional operational submarines by mid-1941. 120 boats on top of the approximately 80 operational boats Dönitz had in the Atlantic at that time would have brought him to approximately 200, still 67% of his 300 target. But within a range where the tonnage war mathematics might have produced genuine strategic stress on British supply systems before the American production mobilization reached full capacity. Speer's calculation can't be verified precisely. It involves assumptions about construction schedules and material availability that are inherently uncertain, but its direction is almost certainly right. Hitler's surface fleet program consumed resources that could have changed the submarine campaign's strategic trajectory, and the men who made the resource allocation decisions in Berlin in 1939 and 1940 were not Dönitz's enemies. They were his colleagues. As the Kriegsmarine's construction program never caught up with the attrition rate that intensified Allied anti-submarine operations imposed from May 1943 onward. In the full year of 1943, Germany commissioned 283 new U-boats. In the same year, 237 were destroyed. Net gain for the entire year, 46 boats. Against an Allied production increase that was adding hundreds of escorts and dozens of very long-range aircraft to the Atlantic War simultaneously. The net gain of 46 boats wasn't enough to replace experience. The men in those new boats were fresh from training, their commanders on their first or second patrol, their crew cohesion untested. Yes, the boats Dönitz was losing in 1943 were crewed by some of the best-trained submarine sailors in the world. The boats he was receiving in replacement were crewed by young men who'd never been under a depth charge. The construction figures looked like recovery. The operational effectiveness figures told a different story. The Liberty ship tonnage figures for 1943 and 1944 are worth stating plainly, because they represent a genuine and largely unacknowledged answer to the tonnage war that Dönitz had been prosecuting since 1939. His strategic target had been 750,000 gross registered tons of Allied shipping destroyed per month. At his peak, October 1940, he'd achieved 352,000, roughly half his target. By late 1943, Allied shipyards were delivering approximately 1,200,000 gross registered tons of new merchant capacity per month. U-boats were sinking approximately 250,000 gross registered tons per month. The deficit between Allied construction and U-boat destruction, the net tonnage gain for the Allies, was approximately 950,000 gross registered tons per month. Dönitz had set out to create a strategic deficit of 750,000 tons per month in Allied supply capacity. By the second half of 1943, Allied industry was creating a surplus of approximately 950,000 tons per month in Allied supply capacity. His war and the Industrial War weren't even comparable anymore. They were happening on different scales. The question that the production figures raise, and that the standard military histories of the battle don't quite frame in these terms, is whether the Battle of the Atlantic was ever, in a meaningful strategic sense, a naval campaign. The naval campaign, the escort groups, the wolf packs, the convoy battles, was the visible expression of an underlying industrial competition that was determined by production capacity, steel allocation, workforce numbers, and the specific organizational insight that allowed a California road builder to reduce ship construction time from 244 days to 42. The admirals mattered. The commanders mattered. The courage of the crews on both sides was real and documented. But the outcome was determined in shipyards, in budget meetings, knowing the specific decision in Berlin in 1939 to build battleships instead of submarines, and in the specific decision in Richmond, California in 1941 to build ships the way you build a dam, one section at a time, as fast as possible, until the job is done. Chapter 12, The Schnorkel and the Desperate Autumn BDU War Diary, the 27th of May, 1943, 3 days after the withdrawal order. The entry is characteristic Dönitz, precise, without apparent emotion, operationally focused. He notes the withdrawal and then in the same paragraph records a formal proposal to the Naval High Command, OKM, requesting accelerated development of the Schnorkel breathing apparatus for all ocean-going U-boats, combined with the Walter hydrogen peroxide propulsion system. But he requests the earliest practicable deployment date. At the foot of the entry, a staff officer has added a penciled note, OKM response awaited. The OKM response came on the 14th of September, 1943. 3.5 months. In those 3.5 months, 63 more U-boats were lost. The response approved Schnorkel development for Type 6, sea retrofit. The first Schnorkel-equipped boat would not be operational until April of 1944, 11 months between the request and the deployment. 63 boats lost in the first portion of that interval. The gap between understanding what was needed and having it available is the story of the German technological response to Black May, and it's a story about bureaucracy as much as engineering. The Schnorkel, originally a Dutch design, adapted from a pre-war Royal Netherlands Navy submarine modification, was not a new idea in 1943. The Dutch boats captured in Rotterdam Harbor in May of 1940 had been fitted with a retractable air mast that allowed diesel operation at shallow depth. And German naval engineers had examined the system in 1940 and decided it wasn't required. That decision, documented in the OKM engineering review files at the Bundesarchiv, was made on the grounds that U-boats were expected to operate primarily on the surface, and that their dive speed and depth capability were sufficient defense against air attack. In 1940, with no centimetric radar in service and no effective Allied air cover over the open Atlantic, that assessment was approximately correct. By May of 1943, it was catastrophically wrong, and the engineers who had decided in 1940 that Schnorkel development wasn't required were now being asked to provide it in 12 months or less. The Schnorkel mast housed 2 tubes, an air intake and an exhaust, that extended above the surface while the boat operated at periscope depth, typically between 12 and 15 meters. The intake tube was topped with a float valve, a mechanism that automatically sealed when waves washed over it, preventing the sea from flooding directly into the boat's interior through the open intake. The engineering was not complicated. The operational consequence of the float valve was, when the valve sealed under a wave, which in North Atlantic conditions happened frequently, sometimes for several seconds per wave cycle, the running diesel engines, and instead of drawing air from outside, drew air from inside the pressure hull. The resulting sudden reduction in interior air pressure was experienced by the crew as barotrauma, a painful equalization event affecting primarily the ears and sinuses. If the valve remained sealed for more than 3 or 4 seconds, the pressure drop was severe enough to rupture eardrums. The Kriegsmarine medical records from snorkel-equipped boats in 1944 and 1945 document barotrauma injuries as a common, expected, and essentially accepted operational consequence of the technology. The men who sailed in snorkel boats were routinely having their eardrums damaged by the equipment designed to keep them alive. They considered this preferable to the alternative. The tactical effectiveness of the snorkel was genuine and immediate. A submerged boat running on snorkel at periscope depth presented a radar cross-section approximately 1/50th that of a surfaced boat. The aircraft sinkings of snorkel-equipped U-boats in 1944 were dramatically lower than equivalent sinkings of surface-running boats in comparable patrol areas. For individual boats, the technology was broadly successful at its primary purpose, keeping them alive long enough to complete a patrol. The strategic problem was that surviving the patrol wasn't the same as accomplishing anything useful during it. A snorkel boat running at periscope depth was limited to approximately 4 to 5 knots sustainable speed, the maximum that didn't create excessive wake disturbance and acoustic signature. Standard convoy speed was between 7 and 9 knots. A snorkel boat that didn't happen to be positioned directly in a convoy's path couldn't catch it, couldn't intercept it after a contact report, couldn't participate in a wolfpack attack that required repositioning. The snorkel saved the cruise. It couldn't restore the offensive. The Walter boat, Helmuth Walter's hydrogen peroxide closed-cycle propulsion system, was the technology that Dönitz had paired with the snorkel in his May diary entry, and it was genuinely revolutionary in concept. A submarine that used the decomposition of concentrated hydrogen peroxide to drive a turbine, producing no exhaust and requiring no atmospheric oxygen, and capable of approximately 25 knots submerged sprint speed, 25 knots, faster than the destroyers pursuing it. It would have completely changed the tactical equation. The Type 17 experimental boats using the Walter system achieved those speeds in trials. The engineering problem was that concentrated hydrogen peroxide, at 85% purity, the grade required for the turbine, was dangerously unstable, prone to spontaneous decomposition and catastrophic fire if it encountered organic contamination, and extremely difficult to handle and store in the operational environment of a working submarine base. British Technical Intelligence Report, BIO's final report, number 648, examining the Walter boat program after the war, concluded that the hydrogen peroxide system had insurmountable safety problems in operational conditions. German engineers who had worked on the program disagreed, arguing that the problems were manageable with appropriate procedures and facilities. The disagreement was never resolved operationally because the war ended before the Walter boat reached deployment. The Type 21. Electroboot was the genuine German technological answer to the Allied anti-submarine campaign of 1943. A completely redesigned submarine that incorporated snorkel as standard, a 124-cell battery bank giving 17.9 knots submerged sprint speed for 90 minutes, and a streamlined hull form that eliminated the external fittings and deck clutter of earlier designs. It was exactly the boat that the Battle of the Atlantic had been demonstrating was needed since 1942. 118 Type 21 boats were commissioned before the war's end. One conducted a combat patrol, U-2511, under Korvettenkapitän Adalbert Schnee, departed Bergen on the 30th of April, 1945, sighted and could have attacked the British cruiser HMS Norfolk on the 4th of May, and received the surrender order before firing. The boat that could have changed the course of the battle arrived in service 11 months after the battle had effectively ended. Its design was studied intensely by American, British, and Soviet naval engineers after the war, and its hull form and battery technology became the direct basis for early Cold War submarine development in all three navies. It influenced submarine design for 20 years. It was too late by 11 months. The men who were sent out in conventional U-boats between May 1943 and the war's end in May 1945 were, in operational terms, already past the point where their efforts could change the strategic outcome. Dönitz knew this. His diary says so, with the same precision it always used. The convoy system was unbreakable by the resources he had available. The air cover was closing areas that had been safe, and the new boats he needed were 11 months from operational deployment. The campaign continued because it had to continue, because the political and institutional logic of the Nazi state required visible military effort, because Dönitz's professional identity was inseparable from the offensive, and because telling Hitler that the U-boat campaign had failed was not a conversation that ended well for the person having it. In 1944, 239 U-boats were lost, approximately 12,400 men dead, at an average crew complement of 52. The average age of a U-boat crew member in 1944 was approximately 22 years. They were being sent out in insufficient boats with inadequate equipment against an enemy that had solved most of the tactical problems the campaign had originally exploited, and they were dying at a rate that the construction program couldn't compensate for in either hulls or experience. The last confirmed Allied merchant ship sunk by a U-boat was the SS Avondale Park. As a Canadian-built standard vessel of 4,407 gross registered tons, torpedoed by U-2360 in the Firth of Forth on the 7th of May, 1945. The 7th of May was the day Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. Whether U-2360's commander knew the war was over when he fired is not documented. The torpedo was fired at 1:23 in the morning. The surrender was signed at 2:41 in the morning, Central European time. The timeline is close enough that the question of knowledge and the question of responsibility become genuinely difficult to separate. The Avondale Park sank with the loss of 2 crew members. The Battle of the Atlantic ended not with a formal armistice or a ceasefire, and not with a dated final engagement, but with a torpedo in the dark on the same day as a surrender, and 2 names added to a list that already contained tens of thousands. The Schnorkel's legacy is more complicated than the straightforward too little, too late narrative usually applied to it. It succeeded at its primary purpose. Boats equipped with it survived patrols that would have killed surface-running equivalents. It saved lives. The men who credited it with saving their lives were telling the truth. What it couldn't do, what no individual technology could do in isolation, was restore a strategic position that had been lost in May of 1943 through the convergence of production, technology, training, and doctrine that Black May represented. Dönitz had written in his withdrawal diary entry that the situation was temporarily lost. The Schnorkel was his response to that qualifier, the technological bridge to the Walter boat, to the Type 21, to the future in which the campaign could be resumed from a stronger position. The technology worked. The future didn't arrive in time. The bridge led somewhere that the war reached before the boats did. The question that the German technological response to Black May leaves open is essentially an industrial one, and it's been examined from multiple angles without definitive resolution. If the Schnorkel had been developed from the captured Dutch boats in 1940 rather than 1943, would it have changed the trajectory of the battle sufficiently to matter? But if the Type 21 had been prioritized in 1942 rather than 1944, would the 118 boats commissioned before May 1945 have been commissioned earlier, and would earlier have been early enough? Speer thought the construction timeline could have been advanced by 12 to 18 months with different resource allocation. Naval historians have generally supported that assessment. 12 to 18 months earlier would have placed operational Type 21 boats in the Atlantic in approximately late 1943 or early 1944, after Black May, but before the Allied escort system had fully integrated the combination of centimetric radar, HF/DF, and VLR aircraft that made the convoy system genuinely robust. Whether that window would have been wide enough, and whether the strategic effect would have been sufficient to change an outcome already substantially determined by the production crossover is a question that the archives raise and decline to answer. Chapter 13, Room 40's Daughters, The Women Who Read the Sea. Bletchley Park, Trust Oral History Archive. Diana Payne, Women's Royal Naval Service bomb operator, interviewed in 1996. She describes her work in the measured, careful way that people describe things they spent 30 years not being allowed to describe, choosing words that are accurate rather than dramatic, because the reality doesn't need dramatizing. She worked 8-hour shifts on the bomb machines for approximately 2 years. She saw paper tape emerge from the machines. She never saw a decrypt. She never saw a convoy report. She never saw a ship. She signed the Official Secrets Act in 1945 and kept it until F.W. Winterbotham's 1974 book made the secret public. When I finally understood, what I had been doing, she told the interviewer, I sat in my kitchen in Guilford and I cried. Not from pride, from the strangeness of it. That phrase, the strangeness of it, is the most precise description I've encountered of what it means to perform essential intellectual labor in complete ignorance of its own purpose, and I think it deserves to be the sentence that opens this chapter. The women of Bletchley Park did not arrive at that peculiar strangeness by accident. They were recruited through a system that was simultaneously meticulous and informal, drawing on university contacts, personal recommendations, and the networks of pre-war academic and professional life that connected mathematicians, linguists, classicists, and crossword solvers across a remarkably small social world. By 1943, approximately 1,675 Women's Royal Naval Service bomb operators were working at Bletchley Park and its outstations, Eastcote, Stanmore, Wavendon, and several others, performing the operational labor that produced the decrypts that shaped Allied convoy routing. In the same period, the male staff of all categories at Bletchley numbered approximately 850. Women were not an auxiliary presence at Bletchley Park. They were the operational majority. They ran the machines that did the work. This is documented in the personnel records that GCHQ has released since 2014. And it was not a fact that the official histories, written by men in institutions run by men in the decades following the war, found it necessary to foreground. The bomb machine itself requires a brief description, because the physical reality of operating one is the context for understanding what those women were actually doing during their shifts. A bomb bay was approximately 2 meters wide and 1 meter deep, containing 36 Enigma-equivalent rotor assemblies. Each assembly a drum of approximately 30 centimeters diameter, mounted in a drum bank that could be set to specific starting positions. The machine operated by running through rotor position combinations at high speed, looking for a configuration consistent with a cryptanalyst-provided menu, a logical map derived from a known or guessed plaintext crib. And then when the machine reached a combination that didn't produce a logical contradiction with the menu, it stopped. The operator recorded the stop, reset the relevant drums to the next starting position, and ran the next section of the menu. An average operational day produced between 20 and 30 stops. Typically 1 or 2 were genuine cryptographic solutions, rotor positions consistent with the day's Enigma settings. The physical element of this work involved repeatedly lifting and repositioning the rotor drums, each weighing approximately 18 kilograms. The women who operated the bomb bays were doing precision intellectual work, reading machine outputs, recording positions, identifying patterns, while performing repetitive physical labor on heavy equipment during 8-hour shifts. It was not clerical work, nor it was engineering labor combined with applied mathematics, and it was performed by women who were told only that it was important, not why. Mavis Lever, later Mavis Beatty, was 19 years old when she began work as a civilian cryptanalyst at Bletchley Park in 1940. Having been recruited from her undergraduate German studies at University College London. In early 1941, working in a section analyzing Italian naval Enigma traffic, she broke a variant of the Italian machine cipher that had resisted analysis for months. The decrypts she produced revealed the movement of an Italian naval force, cruisers, and destroyers, toward a position in the Mediterranean that allowed Admiral Cunningham to bring his fleet to intercept at Cape Matafan on the 28th of March, 1941. The Battle of Cape Matapan was a decisive British victory. 3 Italian heavy cruisers and 2 destroyers sunk, 2,300 Italian sailors killed, and, of arguably greater strategic significance, the Italian surface fleet so badly shaken that it effectively refused to sortie against Allied convoys for much of the remainder of the Mediterranean campaign. Mavis Lever was 19. She had been doing the job for approximately 8 months. The battle her work enabled is regularly described in naval histories of the Mediterranean War. Her name appears in none of them published before the 1990s. Margaret Rock, a year older than Lever and recruited through similar channels, worked alongside her on the Italian cipher, and made contributions to the break that are acknowledged in the internal Bletchley records, but are rarely distinguished from the collaborative work in the published histories. Both women continued working at Bletchley through the war, contributing to a series of cryptanalytic breakthroughs that the official record attributes in aggregate to the team at Bletchley, or to specific senior male colleagues in whose sections they worked. The oral history record, the interviews collected by the Bletchley Park Trust from the 1990s onward, is where their individual contributions become visible, and it's a record that exists because a small number of researchers asked the right questions of elderly women who had spent decades not being asked any questions at all. The historian Sinclair McKay's work, particularly The Secret Life of Bletchley Park, published in 2010, drew substantially on these oral histories and began the process of naming contributors who had been anonymous in the institutional record. The process is incomplete. There are women who worked at Bletchley whose contributions are documented in the machine logs and personnel records, but whose individual stories haven't been recovered because nobody interviewed them before they died. The Naval Traffic Analysis section, which is where the women running the Hollerith punched card machines worked, is the part of Bletchley Park's contribution to the Battle of the Atlantic that almost nobody discusses. And when I was reading through the signals intelligence histories, it struck me as a significant omission. Traffic analysis doesn't require decryption. It works by studying patterns, call sign frequencies, transmission volumes, signal timing, geographic distribution of emissions. A traffic analyst who couldn't read a single encrypted message could still identify that a specific radio frequency had seen a sudden increase in activity, that the call signs associated with U-boat patrol operations were transmitting more frequently than normal, that the geographic concentration of signals suggested a wolf pack assembly in a specific ocean area. During the 10-month Enigma blackout of 1942, when Hut-8 couldn't break a single U-boat signal, the traffic analysis section was the primary intelligence tool available for convoy routing. The women who maintained the Hollerith Card Index, who tracked call sign histories and signal volume patterns, were in that period the most operationally relevant intelligence resource the Admiralty had. They don't appear in the Ultra histories because what they were doing wasn't Ultra. It was something older and less celebrated, and it worked. The Official Secrets Act obligation that Diana Payne described, signed in 1945, kept until 1974, applied to approximately 10,000 Bletchley Park personnel. For nearly 30 years, these people could not tell their families what they had done during the war. They couldn't explain why certain job references were classified. They couldn't discuss their wartime work in employment applications. They couldn't respond to incorrect public accounts of the war that omitted or misrepresented the intelligence contribution they had made. The men in senior positions at Bletchley, the Turings, the Welchmans, the Alexanders, had post-war careers in academia, government, and industry that gave them professional identities independent of their wartime work. The women who had operated the machines, many of whom returned to domestic roles after the war, had the wartime experience removed from the record entirely, not classified and filed somewhere, simply absent. Diana Payne's 2 years on the bomb machines don't appear in any official account of the war, written between 1945 and 1974. She sat in her kitchen in Guilford with the knowledge of what she had done and the obligation not to say it. And when the obligation was finally lifted, she cried from the strangeness. The Colossus computer, 10 machines in operation at Bletchley by the war's end, used for breaking Lorenz SZ cipher traffic rather than Enigma, was operated and maintained primarily by women. Tommy Flowers, the post office engineer who designed it, was refused a patent on the grounds that the machine's existence couldn't be acknowledged, was denied the funding that might have allowed him to commercialize the design, and didn't receive public recognition for his work until the 1980s. He has since been recognized as a foundational figure in the history of computing, and that recognition was long overdue. The women who operated his machine, who ran the paper tapes, monitored the valve banks, it identified and reported faults in the 5,000 vacuum tubes, were operating what was effectively the world's first large-scale programmable electronic computer. Churchill ordered all 10 Colossus machines destroyed at the war's end, along with their engineering drawings and operating manuals, to protect the intelligence secret. The most significant computing artifact in British history was demolished on a prime ministerial order, and the women who had operated it were forbidden from describing what they had done. Their institutional erasure was thorough. Their contribution to the intelligence war that made the difference in the Battle of the Atlantic was real, documented in what records survived, and largely absent from the standard accounts. The scale of the WRNS operational contribution, 1,675 bomb operators, the Hollerith card teams, the traffic analysis sections, the naval intelligence plotting staff, is difficult to quantify in the tonnage terms that naval histories prefer, because their work was preventive rather than active. You can count the ships sunk in a convoy battle. You can't easily count the ships that weren't sunk because their convoy was rerouted on the basis of an intelligence assessment that a WRNS traffic analyst produced from a pattern of callsign frequencies. The immeasurability of the contribution is part of what has kept it from proper recognition. Naval history counts battles, and these women weren't in the battles. They were in the rooms that decided whether the battles happened at all. And in the months when the battles were unavoidable, they were in the rooms that tried to limit how bad they got. The standard measure, ships sunk, ships saved, doesn't capture that. The history that relies on those measures doesn't capture it either. The institutional recognition eventually arrived in the partial and belated way that institutional recognition tends to arrive for people the institution didn't think to recognize at the time. Mavis Beatty received an MBE in 2000, 59 years after her 1941 cryptanalysis enabled Cape Matapan. The Bletchley Park Trust's ongoing oral history collection has recovered hundreds of individual accounts. The site itself is now a museum. Diana Payne's interview is in the archive. The bomb machines have been reconstructed and are on display. Children visit and learn that women operated them. The history is being corrected in the gradual way that histories get corrected. Not all at once, not comprehensively, but page by page and interview by interview. What the correction reveals, when you look at it honestly, isn't a story about the war being won by people who were subsequently overlooked through some kind of oversight. The women of Bletchley were overlooked through a system of classification, institutional hierarchy, professional invisibility, and post-war domestic expectation that worked exactly as it was designed to work and produced exactly the outcome it was designed to produce. The oversight was structural. Understanding that it was structural rather than incidental is the beginning of understanding why correcting it took 50 years. In Chapter 14, The American Lake, Caribbean and the Oil War, Shell Archive, The Hague, Telex from Lago, Oil and Transport Company, Aruba, to Shell Head Office, London, timed at 2:15 local time, the 17th of February, 1942. The message is brief. U-boat attack on refinery jetty. 2 tankers struck. Refinery temporarily undamaged. Requesting naval escort for tanker loading operations as matter of urgency. Current protection, none. The reply from the British Admiralty Caribbean Station is dated the 19th of February, 2 days later, and it consists of a single sentence. Resources unavailable at present time. In the interval between the attack and the response, 3 more tankers were sunk in Aruban waters. And in the interval between the response and the eventual deployment of meaningful escort assets to the Caribbean, roughly late spring of 1942, Approximately 259 ships totaling 1.3 million gross registered tons were sunk in Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico waters, of which 149 were oil tankers. The Admiralty's resources unavailable was technically accurate. What it doesn't explain is why the resources were unavailable in a region that supplied 40% of Allied aviation fuel. The Lago refinery at San Nicolas on the southern coast of Aruba and the Shell refinery complex at Willemstad on Curaçao were, in 1942, the two most strategically important industrial installations in the Western Hemisphere that weren't in the continental United States. They processed approximately 400,000 barrels of Venezuelan crude oil per day. Crude that was piped across Lake Maracaibo and shipped in shallow draft lake tankers to the island refineries, then processed into aviation gasoline, bunker fuel, diesel, and lubricants for export to Allied forces. The aviation gasoline produced at Aruba and Curaçao supplied approximately 40% of Allied aviation fuel requirements at the time Operation Neuland, the German Caribbean campaign, began in February of 1942, 40%. The strategic air offensive against Germany, the close air support operations in North Africa, the carrier operations in the Pacific, all of them ran partly on fuel that was refined on two Caribbean islands and shipped north through waters that had, at the start of 1942, no organized naval defense. Operation Neuland was authorized by Dönitz in late January of 1942, running simultaneously with Operation Paukenschlag on the American eastern seaboard. 6 Type 9 sea long-range boats were assigned to the Caribbean: U-125, U-126, U-156, U-502, U-503, and U-161. Their operational areas covered Aruba, Curaçao, Trinidad, and the tanker routes between Venezuela and the Gulf of Mexico refineries. The Type 9C, with its surface range of approximately 13,450 nautical miles, could reach the Caribbean from Lorient, operate for 2 weeks, and return without refueling. Kapitän Leutnant Werner Hartenstein in U-156 arrived off Aruba on the 16th of February 1942 at approximately 0130 hours and immediately engaged. He sank the lake tanker Pedernales and hit the Oranjestad at the refinery loading jetty. He then turned his deck gun, the standard 105mm weapon fitted to the Type 9, on the refinery's distillation column and fired. The shell struck the distillation unit and failed to explode. A documented dude, the pistol failure noted in U-156's war diary. If it had detonated, the primary distillation capacity of the Lago refinery, and with it a significant portion of Allied aviation fuel production, could have been out of service for weeks or months. The entire subsequent Allied strategic air offensive rested at that specific moment on a faulty firing pin. The Gulf Stream geography that made the American eastern seaboard so vulnerable to Paukenschlag had an equivalent in the Caribbean. The Venezuelan crude had to move through a limited number of routes, and the shallow waters of the Venezuelan shelf and the passages between the island chain of the Lesser Antilles created natural choke points that concentrated tanker traffic in predictable corridors. U-boat commanders who had studied their charts before departure knew exactly where to wait. The routing intelligence they needed wasn't from Enigma decrypts or HF/DF intercepts. It was from published shipping guides, port authority records, and the simple geometry of the maritime geography. The tankers had to go a certain way. The U-boats went to that way and waited. In the first 2 weeks of Operation Neuland, the 6 assigned boats sank 18 tankers totaling approximately 106,000 gross registered tons without losing a single submarine. The Lago refinery dock was shelled. The approach channels to both refineries were mined by U-boat deck guns, firing improvised contact fuse charges. The shipping company offices in Willemstad received reports of tanker sinkings faster than they could process them. The HF/DF shore station network, the direction-finding infrastructure that, by mid-1942, was making U-boat radio transmissions traceable on the North Atlantic, was simply absent from the Caribbean for the first year of the campaign. The network that had been painstakingly built around the North Atlantic convoy routes, covering the approaches to the British Isles and the Canadian coast, had no equivalent coverage of the Caribbean basin. In the absence of HF/DF, the only reliable U-boat detection system available to Caribbean defenders in early 1942 was aerial visual patrol, which depended on weather, was entirely ineffective at night, and covered less than 15% of the relevant sea area on any given patrol day. The systematic direction-finding coverage that was making the North Atlantic progressively more dangerous for surfaced U-boats from mid-1942 simply did not exist in the region where 40% of Allied aviation fuel was produced. The coverage gap was documented. The recommendation for Caribbean HF/DF stations appears in Admiralty planning documents from early 1942. And deployment didn't reach effective levels until mid-1943, roughly 16 months after the campaign began. The oil tanker losses of this period had a specific downstream consequence that I find to be one of the most underappreciated causal chains in the entire war. Between January and June of 1942, the combined Atlantic and Caribbean campaign destroyed 82 tankers with an average cargo capacity of approximately 11,500 tons, approximately 943,000 tons of petroleum products in 6 months. The aviation fuel component of that loss, roughly 30% by typical tanker cargo composition, represented approximately 280,000 tons of aviation gasoline. These at the fuel consumption rates of the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force in the United Kingdom, which in the second half of 1942 was burning approximately 150 tons of aviation gasoline per heavy bomber per month. The tanker losses of the first half of 1942 represented approximately 19 months of 8th Air Force operational fuel supply. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany, which played a documented role in reducing German war production from 1943 onward, was powered by fuel that had to survive the submarine campaign first. The bombers and the submarines were connected by a supply chain that ran through Aruba, and in the first half of 1942, that supply chain was being cut. The workforce of the Lago refinery at Aruba comprised approximately 8,000 people in 1942. Aruban, Venezuelan, Dutch, American, and workers from across the Caribbean basin. They worked through the U-boat campaign with tanker fires visible from the refinery docks and the sound of distant explosions audible on night shifts. Their output sustained the Allied air war. The shell workforce at Curaçao was comparable in size and comparable in its continued operation under threat. Neither workforce appears in any standard account of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Netherlands Antilles received no formal Allied recognition commensurate with their contribution to the strategic fuel supply. The workers received a United States Maritime Commission commendation in 1946, a printed certificate. Aruba and Curaçao's role in sustaining Allied aviation operations isn't mentioned in the formal Allied victory narratives. It's in the refinery output tables, in the shipping manifests, in the fuel allocation records, and in the Shell archive in The Hague, where the telex asking for naval protection and the 2-day delay before the inadequate reply arrived are filed in the same folder, still together. The convoy system that eventually reduced Caribbean tanker losses was not implemented in this theater until mid-1942, following a pattern almost identical to what had happened on the American Eastern Seaboard. British advice, American institutional resistance, months of catastrophic losses, eventual implementation, and immediate effectiveness once implemented. Tanker losses in the Caribbean dropped from approximately 30 per month in April 1942 to approximately 6 per month in July, following the introduction of convoy routing and the deployment of additional air patrol assets. The pattern of the delay, known problem, available solution, months of avoidance, eventual adoption, immediate success, had repeated itself in 2 theaters within 6 months. The question of whether there was a systemic reason for this pattern, rather than simply the coincidence of 2 separate institutional failures, is one that the primary sources raise and don't fully answer. The Eastern Sea Frontier War Diary has its administrative paralysis. The Caribbean Command records have their own version of the same document, with the same rhythm of reports noting losses and requests noting insufficient resources. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. What it actually was, institutional pride, resource competition, or something else, is a question the records raise and historians have not yet resolved to general satisfaction. The strategic significance of the Caribbean theater is systematically absent from Battle of the Atlantic histories that concentrate on the North Atlantic convoy routes, and I think this is a genuine distortion of the historical record. The U-boat campaign in the Caribbean in 1942 was not a sideshow or a secondary operation. It was the closest the Kriegsmarine came to achieving the kind of direct strategic infrastructure damage that the tonnage war fought against individual cargo ships. Could never quite deliver. Sinking a grain ship reduces food supply by 9,000 tons. Shelling a refinery distillation column, if the shell detonates, shuts down 40% of Allied aviation fuel production. Those are different orders of strategic magnitude. Hartenstein's dud shell on the 16th of February 1942 is not a minor footnote. It is the moment at which the entire Allied strategic air offensive came closest to being materially disrupted at source by a single piece of failed ordnance in a theater that the standard accounts of the battle barely mention. The Caribbean tanker war ended, not because the strategic situation changed, but because the tactical environment changed. Convoys, air cover, and eventually HF/DF direction finding made the Caribbean as difficult for U-boats as the North Atlantic had become. By the end of 1942, the exchange ratio that had run at 18 sinkings per U-boat lost in February had collapsed to approximately 4-1, still favorable to Germany by historical standards, but no longer the one-sided slaughter of the opening months. The refineries kept running, the fuel kept moving north, the bombers kept flying. The specific question that the Caribbean campaign leaves open is the one that the Shell Archive telex poses in its simplest form. If naval escort had been present on the 16th of February, 1942, if the Admiralty's resources unavailable had been answered differently, how different would the story of the Caribbean oil campaign have been? The answer, based on what happened when escorts were eventually deployed, is substantially. But the Caribbean escorts weren't there. The reason they weren't there is administrative rather than inevitable, and the gap between administrative failure and strategic consequence, in this theater as in the Eastern Sea Frontier, was measured in burning tankers and a telex that waited 2 days for an inadequate reply. Chapter 15. The Interior of a U-Boat. In February Kriegsmarine Medical Services Report, March of 1943. The document is a table, not a narrative. It contains measurements, mean hemoglobin reduction in crew members after a 6-week patrol compared to pre-departure baseline, 12.3%, mean body weight reduction, 6.8 kilograms. A's documented cases of fungal skin infection, 73% of crew. Cases of chronic insomnia, 91% of crew. At the bottom of the table, the reviewing medical officer has added a note. Not a clinical observation, something slightly more personal. The above figures do not include psychological assessments, for which standardized metrics remain unavailable. Anecdotal reports from flotilla commanders suggest that decision-making quality degrades significantly after the 28th day of patrol. The 28th day. The table is full of measurements, but, that note, the 28th day is the number that sits in the memory afterward, because a standard patrol was 6 weeks. 6 weeks is 42 days. And the document is saying that the men making life and death decisions in the final 2 weeks of every patrol were doing it with measurably degraded capacity, and the medical establishment knew it, and the patrols continued at 6 weeks regardless. The atmosphere inside a Type 6 U-boat on a midwinter North Atlantic patrol was not the atmosphere of a submarine in a movie. It was the atmosphere of a sealed metal tube in which 52 men had been living for between 3 and 6 weeks, sharing 2 toilets, one of which was routinely repurposed for food storage in the early patrol weeks. generating approximately 2.7 kilograms of carbon dioxide per hour from respiration, cooking, and diesel exhaust when snorkeling, and maintaining the interior temperature at approximately 8 to 12 degrees Celsius because the pressure hull was surrounded by water at 4 to 6 degrees, and the insulation was inadequate. Carbon dioxide at 0.5% of cabin atmosphere, the safe limit, produces mild cognitive effects, slightly reduced reaction time, minor impairment to complex decision-making. At 1.5%, the level the BDU's own medical records document as achievable in the forward torpedo room after 18 hours of submerged running without ventilation. Reaction time increases measurably, error rates in calculations rise, and emotional regulation deteriorates. The men in the forward torpedo room had the highest carbon dioxide exposure in the boat. They were also the men responsible for loading and firing the weapons. Any of the diesel engines, two MAN M6 V40/46 units, producing 1,400 brake horsepower each at 470 revolutions per minute, ran at approximately 105 decibels measured in the engine room when the boat was on the surface. The threshold for occupational hearing damage is approximately 85 decibels at 8 hours of continuous exposure. Engine room watch was 4 hours on, 8 hours off, meaning engine room ratings were routinely exposed to approximately 105 decibels for 4-hour periods multiple times per day. Hearing damage was documented in Kriegsmarine medical records as a standard occupational consequence, noted, recorded, and not treated as a reason to modify the patrol schedule. Off-watch crew attempting to sleep did so in the torpedo room, in fold-out canvas bunks wedged between the torpedo racks, or on mattresses laid directly on top of the torpedoes themselves. The torpedoes were maintained at a temperature slightly below ambient to preserve the battery elements in the electric G7E variants. Sleep on a G7E torpedo in February in the North Atlantic was sleep on a cold metal cylinder in a room that smelled of diesel fuel, unwashed bodies, and the specific sweet rotten smell that Peter Kremer, commander of U-333, described in his memoir as the early stages of fungal infection in the bilge water. This was normal. This was what the standard patrol smelled like by week 4. The food supply followed a degradation arc that the medical records track with precision. Fresh provisions, vegetables, bread, fruit, and fresh meat were loaded for approximately the first 2 weeks of a standard 6-week patrol. By week 3, the fresh food was gone, and the crew was eating tinned pea soup, compressed meat ration, hard biscuits, and the preserved items that could survive the patrol duration without refrigeration. The Kriegsmarine's nutrition analysis reports from this period identify a consistent pattern of deficiency symptoms appearing in the 4th and 5th weeks: gum inflammation, indicating early vitamin C depletion, skin lesions in some crew members, and a general decline in physical energy that the medical officer's notes describe in terms consistent with mild malnutrition combined with disrupted sleep cycles. A crew in the 5th week of a North Atlantic winter patrol was, by their own medical services clinical assessment, somewhat malnourished, sleep-deprived, cognitively impaired by carbon dioxide, partially deaf from diesel noise, and living in a space that was perpetually wet with condensation dripping from the pressure hull every time the interior temperature varied by more than a degree or two from the seawater temperature outside. The depth charge experience, what it was actually like inside the boat when an escort ran a pattern overhead, is documented in survivor testimony in enough detail and with enough consistency across different accounts that a reasonably reliable picture can be constructed. The first indication was typically acoustic, the distinctive ping of ASDIC penetrating the hull, audible to the crew, followed by the sound of the escort's propellers directly overhead at high speed. Then the charges themselves. A Mark 7 depth charge containing 130 kilograms of Minol explosive, detonating within disabling range, produced a pressure wave measured inside the hull at approximately 130 decibels, roughly equivalent to standing beside a large artillery piece at the moment of firing, but sustained for the duration of the shock wave rather than instantaneous. The physical effect was concussive. Electrical connections jarred loose. Light bulbs shattered, gauge glasses cracked. The switchboard in the control room was the most vulnerable single point. A close pattern could knock out the boat's electrical distribution completely, reducing control to manual operation of every system simultaneously in the dark. After the first pattern, crews typically worked by torch or emergency lighting, and which also ran on the primary battery, the same battery they needed to maintain depth and maneuver. The psychological architecture of a depth charge attack, sustained over hours, is something I've thought about a great deal in working through the survivor accounts from both sides of the Atlantic War. The accounts from Allied escort crews describe the attacks in terms of activity, calculating, running patterns, listening, adjusting. The accounts from U-boat survivors describe something that has a different quality. Herbert Werner, who commanded several U-boats and survived the war, and wrote a memoir called Iron Coffins, published in 1969, describes a sustained depth charge attack at depth as producing a state of attention that he calls, in translation, absolute presence. Every sound was meaningful. Every vibration had a possible interpretation. The counting of patterns overhead, the estimation of distance from detonation, the assessment of every metallic sound from the hull as either the natural settling of stressed metal or the beginning of a weld seam failure. These were calculations running continuously, simultaneously in every conscious mind in the boat, with no way to stop them and no external input to correct or calm them. Werner's account doesn't describe it as fear in the ordinary sense. It describes something more like total cognitive capture, every faculty directed at the single question of whether the boat was about to flood, with no bandwidth available for anything else. The Knight's Cross data is worth stating precisely because it sits at the intersection of institutional culture and individual mortality in a way that I find hard to describe without the numbers. Germany's Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the Ritterkreuz, was awarded 145 times to U-boat commanders during the war. The criterion was sustained operational success, measured primarily in tonnage sunk and patrols completed. The award was the highest military decoration available to a German officer and carried significant professional and social prestige. The average Knight's Cross recipient in the U-boat arm was dead within 14 months of receiving the decoration. 14 months. The award was, in operational terms, correlated with the kind of aggressive, repeated, all-risk maximizing conduct that produced both the tonnage results that earned the award and the tactical exposure that produced the fatal outcome. The institution was decorating precisely the behavior pattern that was most likely to get you killed, and, in the process, creating an incentive structure that made that behavior pattern professionally desirable. Whether the men who designed that incentive structure thought about the mortality correlation is not documented. The correlation itself is. The loss rate data for U-boat crews is the number that most clearly separates the human experience of the Battle of the Atlantic on the German side from most other branches of service in most other wars. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in operational U-boats during the war, approximately 30,000 were killed, a fatality rate of 75%. The Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, often cited as the service arm with the most disproportionate casualty rate in the Allied forces, lost approximately 44% of its operational air crew. The U-boat service exceeded that figure by 31 percentage points. The men who served in U-boats in the Atlantic War had a 3 in 4 chance of dying in that service. They knew this, or could have calculated it, because the losses were real and the crews talked to each other. What the Kriegsmarine's own records show is that they were not given the aggregate figure officially. OBDU operational analysis documents from 1943 explicitly state that awareness of the full loss rate among operational crews would have a significant negative impact on operational effectiveness. The figure was known at command level. It was deliberately withheld from the men it described. The specific physical object that I find most revealing about the interior of the U-boat experience isn't a weapon or a navigational instrument. It's the bunk. The Type 6C had accommodation officially rated for 44 men in the forward and aft torpedo compartments and the petty officers' quarters in a boat crewed by 52. 8 men had no allocated bunk for the patrol. They slept in the bunk of whoever was on watch, a system called hot bunking, which meant that the bunk was always occupied and never aired, or that the mattress absorbed the sweat and condensation of multiple occupants in rotation, and that the concept of personal space was entirely theoretical. Crew members who served on U-boats consistently described the smell of the bunk as one of the most persistent sensory memories of the experience. Not the diesel, not the depth charges, but the specific accumulated smell of a mattress that had been shared for 6 weeks in a closed metal tube. They describe it decades later with an exactness that suggests it was the kind of sensory detail that doesn't fade the way visual memories do. The material reality of a winter patrol wasn't heroic. It was wet, cramped, malodorous, cognitively degrading, and structurally inclined to kill you. The men who did it repeatedly, patrol after patrol, year after year, actually were doing something that the official record describes in terms of tonnage and tactics, and that the survivor accounts describe in terms of cold metal and the smell of other people's fear. Chapter 16. Overlord's Debt: How the Atlantic Built. D-Day Supreme, Headquarters. Allied Expeditionary Force Logistics Planning, Paper Number 7, December of 1943. The document is a supply calculation, the kind of document that wins wars and never appears in any popular history of them. Its central figure is stated plainly. The minimum pre-assault cargo tonnage required in the United Kingdom theater to support Operation Overlord at its planned scale was 16.8 million long tons. The current cargo arrival rate at the time of writing was 312,000 long tons per week. The required rate to meet the Overlord baseline by the 31st of May, 1944, was 340,000 long tons per week. Margin, 28,000 long tons per week, roughly 8% above current performance. Then, at the bottom of the page, a figure that someone had annotated by hand. Current Atlantic Convoy survival rate, 94.3%. Required survival rate to maintain the tonnage baseline, 90% minimum, 4.3% margin. Someone has written beside this, in neat pencil, sufficient. Not comfortable, not decisive, sufficient. The entire strategic plan for the liberation of Western Europe rested, in December of 1943, on a 4.3% convoy survival margin, and on every decision, technology, and piece of industrial capacity that had produced that margin over the preceding 4 years. The number from Chapter 1 returns here, in the way that real historical arguments return to their premises, rather than simply repeating them. Dönitz needed 300 operational U-boats to achieve the tonnage sinking rate that would strangle British supply lines. He went to war with 22. By the time he had his largest Atlantic force, approximately 119 ocean-going boats in mid-1943, the Allied escort and air system had developed to the point where that number was insufficient for strategic effect. He never reached 300. He was stopped by the gap between his actual construction capacity and his required construction capacity, compounded by Allied escort development, or technological advantage and industrial mobilization. The Shaft Logistics Planning document is the payoff to that arithmetic. The 300 boats Dönitz calculated as necessary in 1937 would, by the modeling that Allied operational researchers were running in 1943, have been sufficient to reduce convoy survival rates from 94.3% to somewhere between 78 and 82%, well below the 90% minimum the Overlord baseline required. 300 boats in 1942 would, in this analysis, have prevented D-Day. Dönitz had calculated exactly what was needed to win. He never had it. The specific material that crossed the Atlantic to make Overlord possible is documented in ways that most accounts of the invasion don't engage with. Operation Overlord required, before the first landing craft touched the beach, the delivery to the United Kingdom of approximately 2.5 million men 500,000 vehicles, and 17 million tons of supplies. The planning documents are explicit that the vast majority of this material came from North America, by Atlantic Convoy. The shipping allocation tables in the British Ministry of War transport files show the specific vessel classes: Liberty ships for bulk cargo, tank landing ships for vehicles, troop ships for personnel. Every ton of this material had to survive the crossing. Every ton that was sunk had to be replaced from reserves that were themselves accumulated from previous crossings. The logistics chain for D-Day didn't begin in the English ports in May of 1944. It began in the North American shipyards in 1941, and every link of it ran through the Atlantic Convoy system that the Battle of the Atlantic had made survivable. The SS William N. Pendleton is a Liberty ship whose cargo manifest for March of 1944 I've spent some time with, because it's the kind of document that translates strategic abstraction into material specificity. Departing from a Gulf Coast port on the 14th of March, 1944, it carried 9,140 tons of cargo, 4 complete Sherman tank turrets and 12 hull sections, 3,200 rounds of 105mm artillery ammunition, 220,000 K-ration food packages, and 2,400 courses of penicillin. The Pendleton arrived in Liverpool on the 28th of March. Its cargo was distributed to 12 different military units across southern England. 3 of those 12 units landed on Omaha Beach on the 6th of June, 1944. 1 cargo manifest, 1 ship, 1 Atlantic crossing, 3 units on 1 beach on D-Day. The logistics chain is that specific, that traceable, and the dependent on the convoy survival rate that the Battle of the Atlantic had spent 4 years securing. Operation Mulberry, the 2 prefabricated artificial harbors towed to the Normandy coast after D-Day to maintain supply flow while the Allies were without a major port, required 400 separate structural components, totaling approximately 1.5 million tons of steel and concrete, manufactured in British factories between November of 1943 and May of 1944. The raw materials for those components, iron ore, coal, timber, industrial rubber, copper wire, arrived in British ports and Atlantic convoys during the same period. The Mulberry Harbor that supplied the Allied armies in Normandy was itself an artifact of Atlantic convoy logistics, built from materials that had crossed the ocean in the ships the convoy system had kept alive. The causal chain runs from the raw material source in North America to the harbor component factories to the Normandy beach, and every link in it passes through the convoy system. The Battle of the Atlantic isn't the background to D-Day. It's the supply chain that made D-Day a physical possibility. The Pluto pipeline under the ocean, a set of submarine petroleum pipelines laid across the English Channel to supply fuel directly to Allied forces advancing into France, was the final element of a logistical system that had its origins in the tanker convoys of the Battle of the Atlantic. The fuel that Pluto delivered came from the Allied petroleum supply system, partly Caribbean refined, partly Middle Eastern, partly American, all of it transported by tanker through waters that U-boats had been trying to interdict since 1942. The first Pluto pipeline, Operation Bambi, was laid on the 12th of August, 1944, 67 days after D-Day, and delivered approximately 172,000 gallons of petroleum per day at its rated capacity. The tankers that had survived the Caribbean campaign, the Eastern Seaboard campaign, the North Atlantic Wolfpack campaign, were delivering their cargo to a supply system that was now flowing under the English Channel to American and British armored columns pressing toward Germany. The pipeline was the end of the supply chain. The beginning was a refinery in Aruba and a convoy routing decision in Liverpool. The D-Day order of battle included 6,939 vessels of all types on the 6th of June, 1944, the largest amphibious fleet ever assembled. 4,126 of those vessels were landing craft, the majority American-built in Great Lakes and river shipyards, where the steel arrived by rail from Pittsburgh, and the assembly workers included a significant proportion of women. The steel itself was partly domestic American, partly Canadian, a partly imported from Latin America and Spain, in ships that had crossed the Atlantic in the Convoy system. The supply chain for D-Day reached back geographically to every continent and, temporally, to the construction decisions of 1941 and 1942. When historians write about D-Day as the culmination of Allied strategic power, they're right. But that power had a supply chain, and the supply chain had a choke point, and the choke point was the North Atlantic convoy route. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a context for D-Day. It was its industrial foundation. What the Shaft logistics documents reveal, if you work through them in detail rather than in summary, is that the Allied military planners understood this relationship precisely. The Overlord planning files contain regular assessments of convoy survival rates and their implications for tonnage accumulation schedules. These aren't background documents, they are operational planning documents. The planners knew, to within a few percentage points, what convoy survival rate was required to maintain the supply buildup on the Overlord timeline. They were tracking it monthly. When the rate dropped, in the spring of 1943, during the last intensive Wolfpack campaign, the logistics files show adjustments to reserve calculations and contingency assessments of timeline extension. When the rate recovered after Black May, as the escort and air systems took effect and Wolfpack effectiveness collapsed, the files show the planning proceeding with renewed confidence. The planners were not unaware of their dependence on the convoy system. They were quantifying it in decimal places every month of the planning cycle. The final accounting of what the Atlantic supplied for Overlord is a figure that doesn't appear in most histories of the invasion, because most histories of the invasion treat logistics as a supporting detail rather than a primary subject. Between January of 1942 and May of 1944, the period of American involvement from Pearl Harbor to D-Day, approximately 35 million long tons of cargo crossed the Atlantic in Allied convoys to the United Kingdom. Of that total, approximately 1.2 million long tons were lost to enemy action, U-boats, mines, and aircraft. The survival rate for the period was approximately 96.6%, as that figure, 96.6%, over 2 years, across 35 million tons, is the number that paid for D-Day. It was achieved by the convoy escort crews, the long-range aircraft crews, the signals intelligence staff, the bomb operators, the shipyard workers, the merchant sailors, and the administrative systems that coordinated all of them. It was achieved against an enemy that had calculated precisely what rate of destruction was needed to prevent it. The enemy's calculation was correct. The enemy's resources were insufficient to execute it. The margin between those two facts is what the 6th of June, 1944, was built on. Chapter 17. The Ocean Does Not Forget. Legacy, Memory, and the Continuing Argument, Tower Hill. Memorial, London. The Atlantic Convoy Conference plaque, installed in 2005, 60 years after the battle ended. The inscription gives the years, the theater, the scale of the campaign. It names no individual merchant sailor, not one. Behind the plaque, on the memorial panels, are 36,749 names, British merchant navy and fishing fleet dead from both world wars who have no known grave other than the sea. The plaque was the subject of 12 years of argument before its wording was agreed. 12 years. The battle itself lasted 5 years and 8 months. It took longer to agree the wording of a commemorative plaque than it took to fight the war that required it. That 12-year argument is not an embarrassing footnote to the memorial. It is part of the memorial's history, part of the record of how a nation decided what it owed the people who had kept it supplied, and what language it was prepared to use to acknowledge that debt, and how long the negotiation of that language could take when the institutional interests in minimizing the acknowledgement were persistent enough. The Battle of the Atlantic formally ended on the 8th of May, 1945, which is also to say that it ended without a formal conclusion because submarine warfare doesn't have a surrender ceremony. U-boats that were at sea on VE Day received surrender orders by radio and were instructed to surface, fly a black flag, and proceed to designated Allied ports. Some did, some didn't immediately. Some were sunk by Allied forces in the confusion of the days immediately surrounding the surrender. The last confirmed Allied merchant ship sunk was SS Avondale Park, torpedoed by U-2360 in the Firth of Forth at 1:23 in the morning on the 7th of May, 1945, the same day Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. Whether the commander of U-2360 knew the war was functionally over when he fired is not documented with certainty. The torpedo was fired. 2 men died. The battle didn't end with finality. It ended by attenuation, boats being surrendered, patrols being recalled, radio traffic falling silent, in the ambiguous procedural way that institutional processes tend to end, and without a last shot that anyone knew at the time was last. There are approximately 783 identified U-boat wreck sites from the Battle of the Atlantic, distributed across the North Atlantic, the Caribbean, the South Atlantic, and the waters around the British Isles. The vast majority are unexplored. Each contains structural remains, mechanical components, and, in most cases, human remains and personal effects. Under international law, wartime naval wrecks are protected grave sites, a status that carries legal obligations regarding disturbance and recovery. Several wrecks have been disturbed by commercial deep-sea salvage operations in the past 30 years. Copper, steel, and non-ferrous metal components recovered for scrap value, and in some cases before the legal protection framework was fully established or enforced. The ocean holds the final resting places of approximately 30,000 German submariners and an unknown number of Allied sailors, and the legal framework that protects those graves is uneven in its application and incomplete in its geographic coverage. The archives are above water. The evidence is below it. Some of the evidence has been removed for scrap. U-864 lies in approximately 150 meters of water off Fedje on the Norwegian coast. It was sunk on the 9th of February 1945 by HMS Venturer, the only confirmed successful submerged versus submerged torpedo attack in the history of naval warfare. A tactical achievement that required the Venturer's commander to track a submerged target by hydrophone and calculate a firing solution that anticipated where the target would be when the torpedo arrived, without being able to use active sonar that would reveal his position. The sinking is a remarkable piece of naval history. What U-864 was carrying is the part of the story that makes it a current problem rather than a historical curiosity. Its cargo included 61 tons of elemental mercury and steel drums, a consignment intended for Japan's weapons manufacturing program. The mercury has been leaking from the corroding drums for approximately 80 years. If the Norwegian government has been debating since the wreck's discovery in 2003 whether to raise it, at enormous engineering cost and environmental risk, or to encase it in a concrete sarcophagus on the seabed, as of the present year, no decision has been implemented. The wreck sits at depth, leaking. The Battle of the Atlantic has environmental consequences that are ongoing. The 3 historiographical debates that have run through this series are worth identifying explicitly because they're not resolved, and because honest engagement with historical evidence requires acknowledging what remains contested, rather than presenting a narrative tidied into false resolution. The first is the ultra-attribution question. Was signals intelligence the primary cause of the 1943 turning point, as Beasley argued? Or did technology and operational improvements account for it more definitively, as Mulligan and others have contended? The evidence supports significant contribution, but not decisive cause, and the simultaneous deployment of multiple capabilities makes clean attribution methodologically impossible. The second is the Dönitz culpability question. Does the Laconia order, evaluated against the documented knowledge of its probable effects on Allied crew survival rates, constitute criminal conduct by a consistent legal standard? The Nuremberg verdict is contradictory on this point. Guilty on the charge, sentence reduced because the Allies did the equivalent, and the contradiction hasn't been resolved. The third is the counterfactual. If Dönitz had received 300 operational boats in 1942, and as his 1937 calculation required, could he have achieved sufficient strategic effect to prevent the Allied supply buildup for Operation Overlord? The production crossover mathematics suggests the Allied industrial response would eventually have compensated. The operational research modeling suggests a significantly longer and more damaging campaign before that compensation took effect. Both positions are defensible. Neither is proven. The seed and payoff structure that this series has used, planting specific numbers and facts early, returning to them when the later evidence gives them new weight, is itself a kind of argument about how history works. The 300 boats figure from Chapter 1 returns in Chapter 16 as the arithmetic explanation for why D-Day was possible. The radio transmission window established in Chapter 2 returns in Chapter 8 as the technical foundation of HF/DF's effectiveness. The weld defect rate from Chapter 5 returns in Chapter 11 as the quality deterioration in late war production. The Laconia Order's 11 words from Chapter 10 return here, in the context of the survival rate data that gives those words their precise human cost. These connections aren't rhetorical devices. They're the actual structure of a causal argument, an attempt to show that the Battle of the Atlantic was determined not by any single decision or technology or individual, but by the accumulation of choices, constraints, and consequences whose relationships only become visible when you hold the entire 5-year record in view simultaneously. The merchant sailor commemoration story is, I think, the clearest window into what societies do with their debts when the people they owe are neither dramatic enough for mythology nor powerful enough to demand proper accounting. The 36,749 names on Tower Hill, and the additional 3,000 to 4,000 names that don't appear there because the Commonwealth War Graves Commission's mandate didn't cover them, represent men who kept Britain supplied through the worst years of the war, at the cost of their lives, without military rank or combat pay, or the protections that the state extends to its uniformed servants. Their formal recognition arrived late, partially, and through persistent advocacy by the unions and veterans organizations that represented them. Merchant Navy Day was established in 2000, and the Tower Hill plaque was installed in 2005. The legal amendments to the wage termination policy came in 1948. Each of these was right, and each of them was late, and the lateness was not accidental. It reflected the persistent institutional tendency to classify these men's service as commercial rather than military, as economic rather than strategic, as the background condition of the war rather than its operational foundation. The women of Bletchley Park received their formal recognition later still, and more incompletely. Diana Payne died in 2014. Mavis Beatty died in 2013. The oral histories they contributed to the Bletchley Park Trust are preserved and accessible. The bomb machines have been reconstructed. The museum at Bletchley Park tells their story with increasing completeness as the institutional reluctance to foreground women's contributions has gradually weakened under the pressure of the evidence. But the official histories, Roskill's The War at Sea, Hinsley's British Intelligence in the Second World War, were written in the decades when the relevant facts were either classified or institutionally invisible, and they haven't been revised. The history of the Battle of the Atlantic as it appears in the foundational official texts is still incomplete, and it's incomplete in ways that a reader without access to the later scholarship wouldn't know to notice. The gaps are invisible from inside the texts. They're only visible when you hold the texts against the archive they relied on and note what they chose not to include. There are still significant archival collections related to the Battle of the Atlantic that haven't been fully processed, fully declassified, or fully integrated into the existing historical literature. Portions of the GCHQ operational files beyond 1943 remain restricted. Elements of the U.S. Eastern Sea frontier records are still subject to access conditions that limit researcher use. The full record of the British Ministry of Economic Warfare's merchant loss modeling, the internal calculations of strategic impact that would confirm or challenge some of the tonnage war assessments in this series, hasn't been systematically published. The Lascar crew casualty records are dispersed across multiple colonial-era administrative archives in ways that make comprehensive research difficult. The battle's documentary foundation is substantial, and the scholarship built on it is genuinely excellent in places, but it's not finished. Historians working on the Battle of the Atlantic in 20 years will have access to materials that current accounts don't include, and those materials will change some of what we think we know. History is not a finished product. It's an argument in progress, with evidence still coming in. The SS Avondale Park's 2 dead, the last merchant sailors killed by a U-boat in the Battle of the Atlantic, are in the casualty registers. Their names are James Dalziel and Hugh McLaughlin. They were killed at 1:23 in the morning on the 7th of May, 1945, in the Firth of Forth, in sight of the Scottish coast. When their ship was hit by a torpedo from a submarine, whose commander may or may not have known, at that exact moment, that the war was formally ending. They had no more warning than the 792 men on the September 1939 casualty lists that opened this series. They had no more military rank, no more combat pay, no more legal protection from the wage termination policy than the men who preceded them. The battle began before the declaration of war, because the sea already had its orders. It ended after the surrender, because the torpedoes were already in the tubes. In between those 2 bookmarks, 5 years, 8 months, and approximately 14.5 million gross registered tons of Allied shipping, is a campaign that was determined by production capacity, decided by technological convergence, and sustained by the labor of people the official record was slow to name. The ocean doesn't forget. The archives are the ocean's memory. What we make of them is our responsibility.